fucking with my mic a bunch too, like with placement, because
Yeah.
because my husband changed the desk setup because he's using it for online classes, and he's a fucking left-handed freak, as I mentioned.
Those fucking freaks, dude.
Yeah, that's not normal.
Yeah. Fucking left-handed freaks.
Yeah, I'm tired of shit today. How are you?
I'm pretty good.
Yeah. Get a nice at-home barber trim.
Actually, I ended up going to his place and he didn't come
Oh,
here.
wow.
Went to his garage and like sat in his garage and he cut my hair.
What was that experience like for you?
It was fine. Like I said, it wasn't like we were strangers. Like this guy's been cutting my hair since I've lived here. So it's like
Yeah.
he's been cutting my hair for like 4 years, but you know, I guess he's in between like studios right now. Like he was at this one place, then he left, then he was at another place, then he left, and now he's like going some other place, one of the casinos off the strip. And
Oh, okay.
he just told me like, yeah, like I'm just gonna take a couple weeks and then I'll be there. I'm like, yeah, whatever. I'll text you. Like, I'm just on his client
Sounds kind of
list.
fucking convenient, though. It's just a traveling barber.
Yeah. Yeah, it's. I mean, you can do that, but yeah, you have to have client lists to actually do that. Like,
Yeah.
So I guess I was just on the list, and he was just sending texts.
I do like the full salon experience, though.
Yeah, that's the thing. There's no place to like get shampooed and then style. There's no blow dryer. Like, yeah,
Dude, I'm all about getting shampooed.
yeah. It is nice when somebody's like has their fingers in your head
Fuck yeah, dude.
and they're like washing
Best
your
part of getting that shit done. It's great.
haircut. Yeah, dude.
I didn't do it for 10 years, and then I did it. I was
Oh,
like,
that's
yeah.
right, dude. You got a real haircut.
Yeah, I got a real haircut this time.
Yeah, dude. It's at that
I paid
age.
too much money for. But I was like, you know what?
What does a woman's haircut cost? Like,
Oh, dude.
I know, like,
Well, it depends on your starting length most places. So, like, you know, my hair was long. That's like a minimum of like 60 to 75. You know, a lot of places, depending on where you go or like what their deal is, it could be like up to 100, 120. But
I figure
I just get like
yeah.
a cut and wash, so it
Figure
was like 75.
a cut and color I would figure goes from like anywhere from like 120 to like if you want to go to like high end, like, you know,
Oh,
sky's
dude,
the
yeah.
limit.
Oh,
Spend
dude,
600,
everywhere is all
700.
about color right now, and like crazy color. And I went to some like real hipster spot too,
Oh,
because there were
dude.
all these reviews. I just wanted a spot that cuts like knows how to cut curly hair, right?
Dude, yeah, that's
Isn't
the
gonna try to
problem,
fucking
man.
brush it out and like do the thing that they do where they like comb it and clip it. Like, you don't do that. Like, that was not what I wanted. I was like, I don't want someone to like comb my hair and then make me look like a poodle.
Dude, that's
And I just saw all these good reviews, but it was hipster as fuck. I walked
Yeah.
in, they were playing Taking Back Sunday,
nice.
and like everyone there was like getting some kind of crazy color done, and I was like, oh shit.
A lot of tatted up hairstylists and
Yeah,
professionals.
my hairstylist had like rainbow hair.
Oh Jesus, dude, I would run.
Oh,
Fuck.
Nah, he was cool. He
If
was
my
cool.
hairstylist had that. But yeah, it's always weird ass shit. Dude, I mean, people, yeah, a good barber cut is going to be, if you're paying under $40 for, you're not going to like a real barber, you're going to like Supercuts or something.
I just assumed like $40 was it. Like, like my husband used to get his hair cut by a barber. Although, like, I think his family knew this barber, so I don't know if they gave him like a cool deal or something. But I feel like it was always like a flat 40, and he'd probably tip him like a 20 or something.
Right, yeah. Yeah. Usually 40, and then if you, yeah, it's same thing if you go to a super fancy salon, like, yeah, you could pay up to $100, but like you don't really need to. 40 to $60 for most men's haircuts if they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
That doesn't include, like, you know, some of them have all those fancy packages like beard trimming and shaving, and you can do all that old school I don't have
Yeah,
to deal
and
with
like
that.
you can like get a beer You know,
Yeah,
there's a
they
barber
usually
near me where they
yeah.
like they'll give you a beer or whatever.
Depends on the state. I know in Maryland it would be much more restrictive in terms of serving alcohol to customers, but in my state, in Nevada, and then when I lived in Louisiana, it was just like, you want a drink? I was like, we don't need a
Yeah.
license to sell that. They'll just give it to you. Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
cool. I usually always say no though, because it's like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm like getting a haircut. And they're like, you want a beer? I'm like, no, dude, it would ruin my entire day. But thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, there's only one spot here that I know, and it's like a barber shop, so I wasn't like going to a barber.
Right. Yeah. Dude, I mean, people underestimate that. Dude, you gotta get a decent haircut. And I see all these young kids now, dude. I see them at the gym and shit. They have like this kind of like, they call it like the Zoomer, like the Gen Z. Like it's like they get their hair cut in this weird kind of like broccoli stalk looking thing where they're like,
Oh my god, dude, the TikTok hair.
yeah, the
Where
TikTok
it's really,
hair.
it's like shaved on the sides and then like it's either
Yeah.
curly or like permed on top.
Yeah, it's like almost
Right?
like it's like a fucking fade, dude.
Dude,
Like
I saw this everywhere. I saw this everywhere when
But
I was in France. And my sister was trying to explain it to me. And she was like, no. The perm is the next thing. I was like, oh no, this has started.
It's the
I've
current
seen this
thing.
before.
Yeah, dude. Like it's disgusting. But I see a lot of these people with these broccoli style haircuts. It's disgusting.
Yeah, and they go heavy on the bang.
My
but,
advice
like,
to
it's up.
dude, my advice to I mean, I can only give it to young men. My advice to young men is like get a decent
Don't
classic
do it.
haircut. Yeah, get a classic haircut. Do not go with whatever's trendy. There's plenty of classic looks, especially for men. You know, it's always a little unfair in terms of like there's classic like styles that you can go into men, whereas like women don't have as many options. Really, they have even more options, so it's like too much.
No, I would say we have too many options.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it's
mean,
like too
you
much.
have all the options in the world.
Right.
You know, it just depends on like what actually will work for you.
I had a student
why it's-
ask me once, yeah, he was like, where do you get your hair cut? And I told him, and this was in Vegas here, and he was like, oh, okay, so how much is that? I was like, well, you know, it's like $60 plus tip or whatever. And he's, oh, it's too expensive. And I was just like, yeah, dude, well, you can go to Supercuts if you want, but you ain't going to get this. Like, they're not going to fade it right, so.
That would happen to my husband a lot at work. And he'd be like, yeah, my wife cuts my hair. And I'd be like,
Oh,
man.
yeah. Sophie getting the
Oh.
haircuts. So if
Yeah.
anybody's looking, Sophie's starting a business here, cutting hair. You can, no, not really.
Yeah, I make no promises. I will occasionally make one side much, much shorter than the other. But, you know, I'm open.
Yeah. Classic cuts, dude.
Classic cuts. You could always go bald like Carl.
Call wiener cuts, dude.
Wiener cuts.
Wiener
They're going to
cuts.
mistake my business for something else. Although I feel like I would be good at that job.
Circumcising or
No, I was
Yeah.
thinking more like waxing.
waxing, yeah.
Yeah,
Oof.
I could be the person who waxes hairy assholes. I just feel it in my bones. Like I could be that.
Like you mean you could
Like
top,
I could
like,
be a person who does gross jobs that have to do with the human body. Like, and I feel like I really fucked up by not getting into one of those fields. Like I could have been like a dental hygienist. I think I'd be great at scraping shit off people's teeth. I think I'd be good at waxing people's assholes.
Yeah, dude, just staring into the sun, dude.
Yeah.
Just strangers putting their cheeks up and spreading, and you're just like, okay, bend over, please.
Oh yeah.
Spread the cheeks.
Yeah, it'd probably get weird. I'd spend way too much time like investigating what their like follicles look like after I pull them out. You know,
Dude, and you would be
I'd
like,
get fired.
I know you'd probably be making like jokes too, and like you'd make everybody uncomfortable. You'd be like, oh,
Yeah.
well, give
I'm
me that little
learning
winking
lately
hole.
that I have friends that it's just like I'm learning that I make them semi uncomfortable because of how much I talk about gross shit.
You're like, bottoms up.
I'm like,
You,
oh,
you,
okay.
you, you like rip one off and then give them a spank, dude. Be like, oh, good job. Like, way to go.
No, just like, you know, detailed descriptions of my dumps.
Yeah. Photographic evidence.
You know, I haven't gone that far. You know, I have a line. Like,
that's
I'm not
pretty
saying I wouldn't
gross.
give it to somebody if they asked for it, but Like, I assume most people don't want that. But I had a friend say to me, you know, I hope it's cool with you that I don't share this information with you, but I am very okay with the fact that you do, and I appreciate it. And I said, thank you. I do appreciate
Jesus.
it. Yeah, man.
What a fucking weird interaction with a friend.
I mean, she was kind of fucking around. But
Right, yeah,
it was
you
fine.
would hope, dude. Because if that
I
was
like,
earnest,
man, do I really, like, do people like, is this, I don't know. Maybe I'm a gross person. I should chill out.
I don't know, dude. We have like 10 listeners that don't mind it, dude, so.
Yeah, hope not. Well, stay tuned for detailed descriptions of this week's dumps.
Dumps this week. Heavy extras.
Heavy extras. They've not been that heavy, if we're being honest. I had one that was like really impressive and then just sort of never again. Dump out flawless, as they'd say on Broad City.
Flawless.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No!
Resources.
Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so.
So here's to a man who probably wouldn't talk about shitting, although I feel like he would subvert my expectations. I say that, and just as I say that, Carl Phillips is going to come out with a book of poems in which there is one just really good one about doing brown.
Dumping.
Yeah,
That could be.
I could see it. He wrote that one poem.
Yeah, but we'll have to wait and see. But today, listeners, is, this is Heavy Board. I'm Andrew Whitstadt.
I'm Sophie Weiner.
And today we're doing Carl Phillips' Coin of the Realm, Essays on the Life and Art of Poetry.
The life and the art.
Yeah. Life and art. We'll talk about a lot of that. People wanting to get artists. Before we get into the book here, let's do housekeeping. So, if you do not know, listeners, we are looking for workshop horror stories. If you or someone you know had a bad experience in a writing workshop or any type of art workshop, let us know about it. heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. That'll be a lot of fun to go into. Send those to us. We also have a subscription plan. You can subscribe to this podcast at patreon.com/heavyboard, where you'll receive full uncensored episodes, bonus content, all that good stuff, all available at patreon.com/heavyboard. If you can't afford that, you don't want to do that, you can support us other ways. You can leave us a 5-star review on Apple or any other podcast platform that lets you leave reviews. You can subscribe to any of our YouTube channels. Give us a like, a share, a subscribe. You know, give it to your friends, families, talk about it. That all helps us out, so do that. And that's housekeeping. Oh, yeah, and including things like we just did listener Q&A bonus, so you only get access to that if you're a subscriber on patreon.com/heavyboard. And we just released the first part. Well, by the time this comes out, we released both parts with our heavy extras, where I go through a couple of the Dracula movies, review them, and that's for subscribers only as well. Carl fucking Phillips. All right, so this book is
A good Halloween read.
a Halloween read. Yeah, we're recording this on Halloween, so it's like a little bit of the festivities still in there. All right, so this was originally published in 2004, I believe, by Grey Wolf, and I think they're still the publisher of it. We talked about Grey Wolf a little bit on the Flynn episode. Do they publish most of Phillips' books, I would imagine?
Who is it that did his last book? Because I want to say that, like, I want to say like one of his last books was like FSG.
Yeah, I have no idea. I don't really like, Phillips poetry,
But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of it came out through Grey Wolf.
yeah,
But
if you
this
don't
was
know-
like earlier on. I mean, his career started when he started publishing when
I have no
80s,
fucking idea.
90s,
Probably.
early 2000s.
I think
I mean,
the
he was definitely
90s.
yeah, that would be my guess.
Those that don't know Phillips, he's one of the bigger figures, if not the biggest in contemporary poetry. I mean,
Yeah. So, yeah, Wild is the Wind isn't his latest book, but it was that was 2018 and that came out from FSG. Yeah. I think in fact his last few have come out from FSG. Which is like, that makes sense. That's one of like the big publishers, right?
it's technically
It's
a bigger
a much-
publisher than Grey Wolf.
yeah.
Yeah.
Right. They put out a shitload of stuff. So if you're like a big hotshot poet who has like a bunch of books and like, collections of like you're collected of a particular time, which I don't know that Phillips is quite there yet. He might be a bit young.
No, but he's getting to
Yeah.
that age where he would.
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, that makes sense that he would be coming out through for our Strauss and Giroux.
And this was in 2004, and I think a lot of these essays were composed, leading up to that.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, that
Right, and we'll
covers
talk
it.
about this. Like some of them
Yeah.
feel like maybe versions of lectures that he might have given.
I think
or-
he said they are. Like, it's literally like craft talks that he then like put into like a published form. And when you read them, listeners, it reads like a fucking lecture. But that's enough on Phillips, I guess. Yeah, if you don't, you can look
yeah,
him
well,
up.
we'll
but
talk
just
about
know,
what that means.
yeah, he's a big hot shot in the field. I believe he still runs the MFA program at University of Washington, St. Louis, or Washington
I think
University.
so.
St. Louis.
I wouldn't be surprised. I also, do you know, is he still doing the Yale Younger, or is that moved on to somebody else now?
Mhm. Probably. Not like anything he's picked's been any good, but
Yeah, I mean, it's a good contest to submit to, right? If you're a poet, you have to be under what, 30? Under 40?
under 40, yeah, something
I think
like
that's.
that.
I think this one's under 40, but yeah, it's one of the big contests that you can submit to. I don't know who is selecting for them right now, but last I heard it was Carl Phillips.
Yeah. So let's get into the book, Coin of the Realm. And we're not going to talk about every essay in this, listeners, but we are going to talk about a few that we found a little bit interesting, and then just kind of overall. Again, we're going to link it in the description. You can pick up a copy if you're interested. If you're interested in poetry, it's definitely something to have on your shelf, because this is, like I said, one of the big poets that wrote this craft book, so might as well check it out. You can always give it away, sell it if you don't like it, but... All right, initial thoughts. What do we think?
Wow. I had a really hard time reading this. Not just because, like, it's not necessarily comprised of especially difficult language, though the syntax might be a little bit. And I will say this is a kind of... He writes with a sentence structure that I think I aspired to for a long time. And it's one that I think works really well in poems and not so well here for this kind of talk. It might not be so much that it doesn't work, or it's just that like what he's saying doesn't quite connect with me. And in places it really, really does. There are places where there are at least a couple of essays that I was really drawn to, maybe a few. But I had a hard time. I would say the second half of this book is maybe more interesting to me. Now, some of that is because there is a lot of close reading throughout this book. I think that is going to be true of most poetry craft books. right? There's often a lot of close reading, and I think there are benefits to that, but I think you also, run the risk of like getting a little bit bored when what you want isn't just an explication of poems. It's like the author's opinions about poems or what poetry should do. And there are places where I feel like he doesn't quite come out and say what it is he wants to say, or there are places where I'm just like, what was the purpose of this? Where it feels like almost taking like a lyric essay approach to writing a craft essay, which I don't always love. It can be great, but it's not, what I was looking to read.
Yeah. Listeners, I'll say this is the first book that we've done on this podcast that I couldn't finish. And really I read all of it except like the last 60 pages. I couldn't force myself through it, dude. Like this was a terrible book.
Yeah, where did you stop after Boone and Burden? Just so I...
It was in like the third section.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like right around there. Because I read Boone and Burden, I took some notes on it. And then I was reading, what is that, another before that, and I was just so fucking like, oh my god, and like the book is bridge, and like all right, Sophie already mentioned it, like his style is fucking grating, like it's not enjoyable, it's not even beautiful, it is hard to read.
Well, it's not enjoyable to me in this kind of context, right? And maybe it's just because he's not getting at what it is I think he like actually wants to say.
What do you mean,
right?
context?
Like it feels
you mean in prose, or
like in prose, yeah, in prose that's not just intended to entertain, right? Like I think
there
on
is
some level he
no
wants to teach or to
entertaining.
inform, right? He wants to teach or inform. He wants to, I mean, I would hope, right? If you're giving talks on craft, that you have opinions about craft that you want to inform your audience of. Not to sound too obnoxious English teachery about it, but there were ways that I felt, and this might not be about the sentence structure. Again, it might just be that like he doesn't say his point so directly in places where I think that he should, in places where I expect a clear point to be made. So I think it's a combination of like this really winding like kind of syntax and also a kind of elusiveness of main points sometimes. I think the combination of those things does make it a little bit grating, but the style in and of itself, like as something that's sort of abstracted from this particular book, like the style, if this is how he writes poems, great. If this is how he writes like, an article that's just like shitting on a movie, great. Like I don't care. This, I think, with something that demands so much attention and demands already like, okay, maybe I have to go out, look up who this reference is, or I have to like, read this poem closely along with you or something like that, I think is asking for at least one of those two things, right? Either like a more straight to the point kind of sentence structure or a very clear point.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I'll say this as we go along, like I think he does make some decent points in some of these essays, but yeah, I think the style is terrible. Like I'm not a fan of his poetry either. I know that's a lot of people are like, oh, like gasp at that. There's just this level of like annoying little fucking nerd that is just like in everything he does. Is like a little cutesy nerdy thing where like it's like this little like look at this. I went to Harvard. Like kind of, and it's
an
just
indirectness
so,
almost. It's indirect.
and I
He's
find
very
it
indirect.
so grating. I think he's afraid of a lot of the points he's making. I think he doesn't really think about them as well as he claims to. And I think the reason it's so boring is because he kind of hides it in this kind of very academic, well, let's do a close reading thing that is in every one of these essays. And it's annoying. Like it it's not like we talk about this all the time, dude. Like we read that Bloom. Like Bloom has a way of writing where like it's very charming. Like you're kind of like
And it's clear.
and it's clear, and it isn't. And even when he does these long, close readings, it is not bogged down by this kind of incessant. Look at how fancy my syntax is, and how many fucking modifications I can fit into this fucking sentence. Like I'm composing a poem. It's just there's always been something about Phillips I just don't like all of it, like his poetry.
Well, and it becomes really mystical in places, which we've talked about in every place where we have talked about poets writing about poetry, the sense of like the sort of, the poetry is this like mystical thing. It's a secret. We can't know how it's made.
Yeah, there's that, and we'll get to that. But just overall, when I was just like, yeah, I did not like it. I could not force myself to finish those last 60 pages because I was just so fucking bored at these some observations, which I think are correct, but then like so many observations that are just like, well, this is what I was told when I attended Harvard, so it must be true. Like kind of, and we'll get into that, I guess, but just the initial thoughts were, I did not like this book, so I'm not going to be that nice to it. I mean, and we've read some difficult. It's not like it was, it's difficult. Like it's not that. I didn't understand what was happening in this book.
Right. It's not so much that it's difficult. It's that like after so long, in the same way that with like a good poem, right? Even if it's difficult, you can only expect the reader to have to do so much work to understand it, and we want the reader to do some work to understand it. Like we expect that. But at a certain point, it does feel like, okay, I'm this far into this essay and I'm like really struggling to locate what the point is. I'm struggling to find and I felt that on several occasions throughout this book. And I also really enjoyed some of the essays, but yeah.
Well, like you said, like, and I think that's where it does show that these were clearly lectures written and designed to be presented to a room full of usually students, so younger people, and then I guess Grey Wolf probably approached him to publish something like this, and he just pulled these lectures out of his ass and said, oh, these are my essays on craft, and like they weren't composed as essays, man. They were composed as a little fucking lecture to people.
That's the thing, though. Right before this, so I went ahead and just to like see what was out there, I went ahead and pulled up a lecture, and one that was like sufficiently close to the time of this book. So I think the lecture was like from 2009 or something. All right, this book's from 2004. I was like, whatever, close enough. And when I was listening to it, it did very much sound like a person standing at the front of the room reading off of their paper. Like it felt like
right, and that's what these read like.
Boring. And so like I would say that even if this is like composed to be a lecture, I would say, well, like, damn. I think these are better for reading than for being spoken, right?
Oh God. I mean, yeah, if I was sitting in a lecture with some of these and somebody was reading this to me, I mean, yeah, I'd be falling asleep.
I'd be leaving.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Walk out of that panel, go to the next one, dude.
And I'm not trying to like say that to be a dick. Like it's very possible that his methods have changed. It's very possible that he doesn't really give a shit about giving lectures on the craft of poetry like this. But yeah, it did not capture my attention. I like his poetry. I would say I enjoy his poems a lot more than you do. So. And I will like continue to buy his books, but maybe
I've only
not
read
his
like
craft
two
books.
of his. Yeah, I've only read like two of his poetry books and then this craft book, but I'm not a fan of any of it. But like I said, we'll go into. There are good points. I think he makes good points. He's not a moron. He's not unqualified. He's not stupid, right? Like he knows what he's doing. I'm just not a fan. All right. Well, let's get started here. This whole thing, we got to hit the case for beauty. First essay and the collection here.
And one of the shortest.
Yeah, and the shortest. It seems like it was composed as kind of like an introductory thing.
Yeah, so it's called The Case for Beauty. And there are sort of three key words here that I would point to in terms of what he's talking about. So he talks about beauty, authority, and abstraction, all as they relate to poetry. Not 100% on what his definitions of these things are, which, to be fair, can you so easily just give a definition for any of these things? Probably not, except for maybe abstraction.
All right, so let's read the first paragraph. Beauty,
Yeah.
at least when it is referred to by that name, suffers the same treatment by too many contemporary poets and students of poetry, as does authority in poetry. It gets dismissed as naive or irrelevant or somehow on the wrong side of the field on whose other side we are all assumed to have happily set up camp together. But to hold that assumption is to exercise the very sort of authority that the mysterious they hold suspect. It also suggests that beauty is monolithic, one-dimensional, and finally inorganic, without the capacity for evolution, without susceptibility to time. So he's kind of starting off, and it's, we talked about this a little bit on the color episode, but it's always like, I find it interesting that these Ivy League guys always start their fucking craft books or their theory books, and we talked about this with color, right? With this lamentation, like it's almost like a lament about, whoa, what I see happening in contemporary poetry today is awful, but, I'm a part of all that, but, I'm just going to sit here and write a book about how it's awful.
Or here's what's wrong with poetry now.
Right, yeah. And we'll get into how he diagnoses this, but, just the idea of this first essay, he's examining, okay, what is beauty? Why do we like it? What are all the forms it can take? It can take all these different forms, right? Capacity for evolution, susceptibility to time.
But again, this is one of those places where I feel like he's trying to say more than he's actually saying on the page, and I wish he would just say it.
What do you think he's trying to say?
Well, that's the thing. I'm not sure, right? Because I can't nail it down any one which way. Like, it feels like maybe, like he says this thing down toward the bottom of this page, equally on the rise. So he says earlier than that, there's an ever increasing unwillingness to think as athletically, that is without the safer toeholds of the concrete. And I'm not sure what he means by this, right? There is a general nervousness that I see symptomatic of an ever-increasing unwillingness to think athletically, that is, without, as opposed to in concert with, the safer or easier toeholds of the concrete. So is he saying, talking about beauty is harder than talking about something that, lives in the concrete world? That's how I'm reading it. He goes on to say, equally on the rise, an unwillingness to be held accountable, to take responsibility, which is what authority requires. It forces the artist to take a stand and to reckon with such issues as intention, meaning, self, and their relationship to what Marianne Moore calls the genuine.
Yeah.
I mean, when he talks about being held accountable here, right? So here's how I'm reading it. Poets are increasingly unwilling to deal with things that are abstract in nature because they are unwilling to take a stand on what maybe like a definition of what that abstraction is, or to take a stand on their particular viewpoint. They're reluctant to put forth a particular position lest they be, I don't know, picked at or made fun of or told that they're wrong, right? Even though it's a poem, right? Your poem doesn't have to align with your views perfectly, right? Or so I would think. And then he says that abstraction is generally conflated with authority.
Yeah.
So I guess
he's not
I'm
mentioning
trying
a
to get at,
specific thing, but he's talking
Yeah.
about contemporary poetry. I mean, he's talking about how shitty it is, like we talk about on here. I mean, everybody
yeah, but without
knows it.
saying it, it feels
because he's a pussy. But I mean, his position, he could say it if he wanted to, but of course he won't
like,
because
well, that's
he
what I
wants
mean.
to be.
It feels like there's something he actually wants to say that he's not saying, and that's what I find maybe a little bit frustrating here.
Yeah.
Like, I would love for him to explain abstraction as conflated with authority, what that actually means. He says like what authority requires, but he doesn't say what authority really is, which again, how do you do that? But he must have some idea about what that actually looks like in a poem. And maybe elsewhere in this book, he goes on to talk about that more in maybe slightly more concrete terms. But here, I don't feel like he really does. And I'd like to see, I guess all throughout this book, I was asking myself, what do we mean by authority? Is it just a willingness to say something about something abstract with, I don't know what to call it, except like, again, except authority, right? To have conviction about something that is abstract.
Yeah. He goes on to talk about authority in a few different essays, but here he's just kind of laying it out. But yeah, the abstraction is generally conflated with authority because, again, poetry sucks right now. And so people just do these abstract nonsense and then call it like really, really nice shit. But then also the concrete, right? He's like, but we can also, and the whole thing he talks about is striking a balance. I agree with you. We don't really know what we're talking about in terms of authority here. Because he doesn't actually come out and say it. But there is an essay on it, right? With, like,
Yeah, I do wish that he would. I do wish that he would just like give us some sense of how he would define that here.
Well, he goes into it a little bit throughout the book, and we texted a little bit about this, where what he calls authority, I think, is he's mistaking for what we refer to a lot of times as confidence or, drive, all that kind of thing that's slowly built up. Because I mean, how the fuck does one have authority in poetry? Well, you could say they know everything there is to know. If you know all the rules and things, okay, you could be an authority that way, or you could just be in charge. I mean, he's talking about authority over a fucking, creative poem, like something somebody made up. So
yeah, but
I
would
think
guess that he's.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, like when we talk about authority in terms of poetry, like I don't think we're really talking about anything, because it's a fucking made up thing. Like it's, who has authority over this? Well, clearly the poet does. But then you could argue the reader, sure. But I just mean, so then when we're talking about that, we're just talking about interpretation and like calling that authority. We're talking about confidence, willingness to take a risk. We're calling that authority. And I just, one of the many instances.
I interpreted it as like the authority of like, what poems say, right? Like presenting statements with like in a poem as a kind of authority, coming to conclusions about things in a poem in a way that shows authority, right? Like if you talk about, like when you think of like poems that make really lofty statements.
But that's what I mean.
Right?
Like, what does he mean about authority in that sense? So if you make something, or what we would call an authoritative statement.
Well, I don't think it's about, I mean, and again, this is just how I sort of was reading it. I think he means like coming to a conclusion.
As a
in
reader,
a poem.
writer?
No,
Yeah.
as a writer.
As a
Like,
writer.
About big ideas, especially. Like coming to a conclusion that is your own, where you're speaking as an authority from your experience. But like, I don't know. Again, like I don't feel like I have enough here to know that with any certainty.
That, and as I hear us talking about it, I'm just always like, yeah, like what is that though? Like it's like we call it authority, but it's like, like the willingness to come to a conclusion or to put a conclusion in there confidently,
Right. Well, I think,
so then it's
yeah,
like,
but I think that's what it is, right? Like it's, a
so we're talking about, you
like,
could
do you
say
say
agency,
this? Yeah, I mean, sure.
skill.
I think when it's authority, though, it's like, how do you, at least in terms of the way I'm talking about it, in terms of like in a poem, like, why do we accept a particular poem's authority on any given subject? Like, why would we read Emily Dickinson and say, okay, you have something to say about this, right? it almost feels like when you finish one of her poems, you've learned some kind of little lesson. And I think that, often in poems, poets will make statements and we look for ways to understand them as true. I kind of think that's what authority is, right? To read something that a poem says and say, yeah, like, okay.
Yeah.
I can accept that as true.
We'll come back to that because it's going to keep coming up when he mentions authority. He mentions it in almost every essay. Not all of them, but a lot of them that we're going to go through. But before we move on from the case from beauty, this part on page 4, just like a question I have generally, I don't know if we'll get an answer on that second paragraph on page 4. It says, the point about beauty is to see it. The point of the poem is not to say anything about beauty, but to enact the vision of it. And my question is just like, okay, so like, what is the point of beauty, or what will we say? What will we say he's saying, or we are saying, or?
Well, I mean, that was going to sort of be my question. Like, what is the case for beauty that he's making here? I would think that he's essentially, and I can only get that from this particular statement, that, he's saying that beauty is sort of the point of poetry, right? Like the poet seeks to make something in the vision of beauty, not to say something about beauty necessarily, but to say something in its vision. But then he says, as for statements in a poem about beauty, that's precisely where, if it has been successfully enacted on the page, the vision's work begins. All right, so now he's moving from enacting beauty. So if it's successful, and then it also says, has something to say about beauty, it has succeeded.
Yeah.
Should all poems be about beauty? Like,
Well, this is where it gets kind of like, this is where I say, this is why I bring up the, Ivy League education and all this kind of stuff. This is what has been repeated, I think, without much thought at all, which is what he's arguing against, for centuries at this point. I mean, it's just been repeated by people that have had it repeated to them, that the point of poetry is beauty. Everybody, we talk about this all the time. Everybody is looking for a reason, an excuse, an explanation as to what poetry does, right? Like, poets have always, like, for some reason, like, defending this as if, like, it's like a vital fucking, I don't know. I mean, I guess because it's never been popular and they always feel like they have to defend themselves, and the Academy is constantly cutting funds and things like that. I don't know. But yeah, I was just
and then he provides this poem, right? And it took me, like, I had to go look it up to double check, because, like, I assumed that because there was no named author, that this was Phillips' poem.
Whose is it?
Huh?
Whose is it?
It's his poem. It's Phillips.
Oh, it's his poem?
It's Carl Phillips' poem.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's why, like, I was like, okay, so there's no name here, so it's yours. And then the poem ends, this is my case for beauty.
Oh, that's the poem ending? I thought that was, like, the end of the end of the essay.
Oh, well, that might be it, too. You're probably right. Because it's not indented.
Yeah. So he quotes himself and says, this is my case for beauty. Oh, God. Oh, God. Whatever. It's, whatever. All right. So, yeah, the point of beauty, I don't know. I don't know what I would say the point of beauty is, but I like it. I like beautiful things. And this is similar to the color argument, right? Where he's like, all these people, again, particularly Ivy League educated poets, are sitting there saying that, like, oh, just appreciate it. Just appreciate it. Don't ask too many questions. Just appreciate it. Just sit there and, like, respect it. Respect the authority, right? Or something like that. And I'm just like, yeah, okay. Maybe we could do a little bit more work than that, but we'll see.
Yeah.
What am I thinking? All right, let's move to the first one. Myth and fable. Hold up, I gotta pee real quick. Hasty toilets.
Yeah.
Hasty toilets.
Make hasty toilet.
Myth and fable, which is the second, really the first full essay in this. So I liked a lot what was said about this, but I do have issues. Page 7, I just wanted to ask the question. At the bottom of the first paragraph, it says, the human instinct is toward rationalization. Words are the agents of rationalization that precede science, and they remain what we hold on to in those areas, the metaphysical, where science remains, thus far, inadequate. Cardiology cannot yet account entirely for the broken heart. And I just wanted to ask, what do we think about that? Because I kind of like the idea of the human instinct toward rationalization, but what do we think?
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes sense, right? Like, you know, we use words to rationalize things, to make sense of things, to understand the relationships between things.
Yeah, my only issue is to say that the human instinct is toward rationalization, because then he goes into the myth, right? If myth is our means
Right,
of
but
explaining.
you could also say the human instinct is toward feeling, you know, and that would be no less that would still be correct too.
Right, and feelings can
So
be
it's-
incredibly irrational. So that, I mean,
Right.
you know,
So that's what I'm saying. Like, it's making the statement, but it doesn't make its opposite any less true. I mean, if you would consider what we just said its opposite, I don't know.
and this does
But yeah.
it gets to a little bit like same thing that Color did. Listeners can go listen to our Color episode 19, available at patreon.com/heavyboard. It was like where he mentions the kind of spiritual aspect of poetry, and I think that's what he's really getting at, and Phillips is in this case when he's talking about beauty and things like that. And I'm an atheist, if listeners don't know already, so I'm usually skeptical, but but being an atheist doesn't mean that I reject the spirituality aspect of this. Like that's why I'm so fascinated by it, because I think it's correct. Like I think this kind of like that instinct to romanticize is part of that rationalization that he's talking. Like it's part of this kind. Like there's something in these things, in a good poem or in a good book or something that we struggle to explain why we like it, or why it hits us in a certain way, and we try to, but I guess
Or
it's
why
hard.
we feel the need to constantly be reproducing something in its image,
Yeah. But I think that gets to the spiritual, right? So there is something that is hard to talk about. And I guess, like he says, it's easier to do a fucking close reading than it is to talk about this, like, very vague, people call it God or religious, like, instinct that we get out of art. So it is, I don't know. I'm fascinated by that. So keep waiting for these people that have, more prestigious degrees than I do in these subjects to put something interesting down. It just hasn't happened, but...
Well, the funny thing is it tends to end up being like clearer when it's alongside a close reading, right? Because you can point to this and say, here's an example of, like what this hard to define thing does, right?
Yeah.
Here is the particular word phrasing that, brings it out. But yeah, when he said, are you talking... cardiology cannot yet account entirely for the broken heart.
Right, and I think that is a very good point.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, do you want to sort of explain what you think he means there? I mean, I think it's sort of like we know that the broken heart has a significant impact on us, but it's not as though cardiologists everywhere are able to. Like, science can't explain every facet of it.
Right.
Rationality can't explain every facet of it. Not yet, he says.
Right. If it ever will, I mean, I guess, yeah.
I mean, is that correct in your view?
Yeah, I mean, we could push the glasses up and get reductive and say, well, it's chemical, in the brain. But, even then, neuroscience, we have very little understanding of things like this. So maybe that gets to authority, right? No authority to say one way or the other. So I don't know. I mean, I think that the way he phrases it does get it across, though, right? Like he's at least he's trying to make in terms of like the place of myth and fable in poetry. So if myth is our means of explaining to ourselves what we know but don't understand, then fable is how we convey what we have come to understand to those who are less experienced and are in need of instruction.
Yeah.
Myth and fable. Part of me wanted to say that a lot of that's a distinction without a difference, but I know that there's like they do distinct these are distinctions that they make in like, you know,
I was
literature,
looking for
scholarship.
distinctions. I mean, the only one that was like, okay, is there a clear moral to this story? Like, because that's really the point of the fable, right? It's to like give a lesson to some degree.
Yeah, and on page 8, I'll read this little section that I marked 2 paragraphs, but I do have an issue with some of it where okay, so page 8, middle of the page there, first full paragraph, he says, "We can only know anything through the lenses of our own experience, and we will tend to explain what we don't understand through what we do. In this sense, mythology is a comforter of sorts, putting the seemingly meaningless within the context of meaning, that is, of nameability as a form of possession. Part of the pleasure of mythology has to do with ownership, with establishing superiority over that which threatens, psychologically, to overwhelm the part of us that is empirical. Fable, especially in the context of the fairy tale, takes particular advantage of the empirical instinct in humans that need to prove a thing through sensory experience, and becomes a means of pointing out the dangers of empiricism. More often than not, it is designed for children, designed by adults who have learned by trial and error, and conveyed in such a way as to instill fear. To some degree, fable would appear to be a means of helping children to do the impossible, namely, to ignore the empirical instinct. Part of the tale's purpose is to show that near disasters that can result from undisciplined or unthinking behavior, running away from home, spending too much time listening to strangers, etc." Right, okay, I'll stop there. But my thing with this is, like, I don't mind that framing. Like, I really don't mind that framing of mythology and fable and all that. I don't mind it. But what I do find an issue with is what his, like, kind of premise is leading up to this. Like, in terms of our, what he calls...
We can only know anything through the lenses of our own experience. And
Not
we'll
only...
tend to explain what we don't understand through what we do. That sense makes sense to me.
That yeah. Like, that's the framing. I don't mind the framing, because that is what we do. But it's like to overwhelm the part of us that is empirical, right? This idea, because I think this premise that leads up to this idea, just like puts the fault with human beings being too empirical to appreciate beauty. So the fault is with humans, not in the man-made thing we call poetry. And I just find that. Somebody who has a degree from Harvard, I just find that so hard to just accept. Like, and it would be, oh, well, I'm trying to rationalize it. And I'll be like, no, I don't think so. I think you're literally blaming humans for, I don't know, not liking poetry, not appreciating the beauty. Like, oh, it's actually a fault within us so that we can't appreciate this thing that human beings made up. Like, and it just drives me a little crazy when I see smart people making this kind of...
Can you restate what you think the argument is? So he thinks, or you think that he thinks that we can't, that when he says, part of the pleasure of mythology has to do with ownership, with establishing superiority over that which threatens psychologically to overwhelm the part of us that is empirical. And you're saying that this has to do with beauty. I really struggled with this sentence and following it.
You're asking me what?
What you think his argument about its relationship to beauty is.
Well, not just the relationship to beauty, but this sense of, like, human beings. Of course, there's, like, if we're going to explain myth and fable in terms of, like, well, they're actually, like, because of these flaws in being human, I just think that doesn't cut it. Like... And this is why I mentioned the spirituality thing. He doesn't really mention that here, but it's like, this is why I'm so fascinated by that aspect of it, because I think that's what he's trying to get at. But it's just like, it's just too easy to say, oh, well, we have a fault, like we have a problem with the way our brains work as human beings, and therefore
Yeah.
we can't appreciate or
We're
understand
too individual.
this man-made
We can only see
thing.
through our
Yeah.
experience, and therefore we can't appreciate a larger concept like beauty.
Yeah. And it is this, I mean, he gets more into this in terms of like nature and like consciousness and things like that. But we'll get to that. I have an issue with a lot of the framing.
My issue was just that a lot of it, I don't know. I wanted it to present me with something beyond. We use myth as a way to reinvent over and over again a story about ourselves. And yet make it new every time. That's really what I got from this essay. It was that, like, here are the ways in which we use myth. Here are the ways in which this myth is used over and over again by all of these different poets and manages to make this spectacularly new thing with a single story. And I just think, like, okay. I feel like, did we need this introduction to, like, you know, the putting the seemingly meaningless within the context of meaning, that is, of the nameability of a form of possession? Like, do we need all of this explanation beyond we tend to see things through our own experience, and thus ultimately, like, it's not actually that it hinders our ability, but it's what, like, allows us to take myths and make new stories and new poems from them over and over again? Like, is that not...
Well, he says on page
Like,
11 that poetry shares then with myth and fable the strategy of building a story around human experience as a means of explaining that experience, or attempting to, and as a means of sometimes offering instruction regarding that experience. Always instructing with poetry. Everybody wants it to do something. Yeah, everybody wants it to do more than it can.
I mean, like, you know, it can instruct, but, like, it doesn't have to.
I don't know if I've ever read one to instruct, but I know that's, you know, what's that famous quote,
you might
right?
not read it to instruct, but poems do attempt to instruct, you know, even like tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Right? That's an instruction.
Yeah.
On how to live, right? They're often like trying to provide some kind of view on the human experience that you can take and learn. But, you know, yeah, in that on page 11, what makes it possible to write an original love poem is that we are, again, each in possession of our own lens of experience. Okay, so, like, here, to me, it's like the whole last several page, like, up until, like we didn't need anything after that last paragraph we talked about. What makes it, because this is, like, I think what the rest of this essay is actually about. What makes it possible to write an original love poem is that we are, again, each in possession of our own lens of experience. No one can ever know the world precisely as each of us uniquely does. This is what is being referred to when Eliot speaks of the relationship between the tradition and the individual talent. This latter being what I mean by the term lens of experience. He then goes on to say, it is the reason why the fact of Homer does not obviate the need for Shakespeare, nor does Shakespeare obviate the need for Emily Dickinson or Langston Hughes, which just means, you know, just because we have Homer doesn't mean we don't also need Emily Dickinson or Shakespeare, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? Which seems obvious.
Yeah,
which I guess is the conclusions of this essay feel too obvious to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of...
It feels like a really basic lesson that you learn as a young poet in, like, a lower level course about why we tell stories. Right? Like, it doesn't... This seems to me a really sort of standard, basic, like, conclusion that does not require this much build-up with so much talk of myth and fable beyond sort of your initial definitions.
Yeah. I mean, I take a little bit of an issue with this kind of. I think it's just something that's repeated all the time, so people just take it as fact. So we each have this unique experience or whatever, and I find it hard to buy that in a lot of this stuff. But
I do and I don't. Like, I
you
get what
know,
you're saying. We're more
but
alike than we are different, right? But, your
yeah,
brain literally makes connections differently than anyone else's,
and
right? It makes a lot of the same ones too.
this
So I
and
think we tend to emphasize that individuality maybe a bit much, right? Because everyone's concerned
well,
with their originality.
that and this idea of being an individual when we're all pretty much the same. I mean, he goes on to say, well, this is what gives it resonance, right? So we can't really get this resonance. He said this resonance gives poetry the valence and stamina of myth, at which point it can fairly be called great poetry. And I was like, yeah, so this kind of lasting thing, right? Bloom talked about this on our Bloom episode. I think Color talked about this a little bit when we did Color. Listeners can go back and complain and yell at us about it if they want, or agree with us, right? Put it in the comments. But yeah, and I just and a lot of that resonance comes from the universal, like this idea
Yeah.
of the more universal as opposed to the uniquely individual aspect
Well,
of it. So
right.
I just,
And I think that
as if we all
ultimately
feel love a
is where
different
this book
way.
goes.
Yeah, well, like as if we all feel love or something a different way. Like I don't think that's true. Like I don't think we're
Right.
biological animals. Like we're fucking animals. Like we don't have this
Yeah, well,
unique
that's
way
what
of
I'm
feeling
saying.
love.
Like,
We all feel it similarly, like pretty much the same. But then we put
yeah,
words to it. Now we're saying that, that lens of experiences, and I mean, I guess it is. He's talking about a unique voice, maybe. So I don't want to be like completely disregarding his point, because I mean, he does have one.
yeah, it
But
just seems obvious. And for, something obvious that just doesn't, I think also maybe what you're touching on here is that it talks more about uniqueness than it does about what he calls resonance. Right? Like, I mean, and it doesn't really talk about that sort of universality as much, maybe, as it could. Which I don't remember. I read this one a while ago. But the way I'm understanding is like, the myth is the thing that's universal, and like the poet's sort of originality or their individual experiences, the twist that you put on the same story
yeah,
that
and
allows that story to continue to have resonance. Like, most of what I got from this is really just what I already said. Like,
well, that's what he says. He says myth and fable are distinguishable by their applicability across time and cultural differences. When poetry has this quality, it is called, or I call it, resonant. Right, so this kind of, and he goes on to say, kind of great or lasting poetry, right? Poetry that stands the test of time, type of thing. We would call great poetry. And then he goes on to use a lot of different examples. He uses the different examples from of Little Red Riding Hood, in terms of two poems by two different poets that use the fable of Little Red Riding Hood in this new way. And I don't know. I just don't buy it with this kind of, every time
myth and
somebody's,
fable are distinguishable by their applicability across time and cultural differences.
yeah, and
Oh, okay.
there's,
Sorry, that took
yeah,
me a minute to understand what he was saying there. Yeah,
and
so he's just talking about what makes poems great. Do
yeah,
they stand the test of time? Without actually really saying what that is. Or he says some poetry takes on a mythic subject. So this is what he was saying about abstraction, right? These are abstract things: love, death, loss, fear. These are mythic in his view.
and then goes on to give us examples with these poems. Like I said, Little Red Riding Hood, where these two poems take the fable of Little Red Riding Hood and kind of use it in their poetry or in the poem to retell it, give a different perspective, and there's pages of this, listener. There's pages of
Yeah,
him
and
doing
it
this.
feels made unnecessarily complicated for an
Yeah.
idea that doesn't seem as complicated as I think he's making it.
Yeah, and whenever, I just glaze over a little bit whenever when there's a poem that I think isn't that good or something, and somebody starts telling me, oh, it's about, story itself, as he says this one poem is, and the telling of it, writing itself. It's about this, and I'm just like, this isn't explaining. Like, like I don't know what. Like, why do we just accept that as an explanation? Is like, oh well, it's about writing. I'm like, okay, whatever. We'll move on. I don't want to. This fucking.
Did you have a typo in this one though? On the last page.
Of what?
Of this essay that we were just talking about. So on 32, when he's quoting a poem, he says it's it's the last paragraph. When I read the lines about how, quote, an arbitrary chorus speaks of a totally different incident with a similar name, in whose tale are hidden syllables of what happened so long ago before that, in some small town, one different summer. Is it different or indifferent?
I don't know.
Turn back a page.
You talk about the quoting of the poem?
Yeah. The Ashbery poem. Turn back to 31 at the top of the page. It says, in some small town, one indifferent summer is the last line. So I was curious about that. I didn't look it up. I forgot to.
Huh, yeah, little typo. I mean, again, dude, this shows where the state of publishing is right now. I mean, it's not good, listeners. We all know it. If you're listening to this podcast, it's because, you're desperate. I mean, that's why we started this podcast. Because we couldn't fucking find anybody that actually gave a shit. And that shows, in even publishing at a great press like Grey Wolf and somebody as big as Carl Phillips, well, little things are going to go overlooked and there's going to be typos in published works, so... I maintain that it's one, people don't read anymore, and two, it's because we edit everything on screens now, and every study just shows us that you miss things when you edit on a screen. Another trick for writers, if you're interested, you're having a hard time editing your shit, print it out. Print it out and look at it on a printed page. You'll start noticing things you won't on a screen. But on page 21, and this goes back to kind of like the kind of glaringly obvious points that keep being made, where he says, each time we return to a myth or fable, we see it different necessarily, because we return with deepened and broadened experience as readers and as writers. And I get this is a craft book, he's talking about that, but there's a lot of glaringly obvious shit that we've touched on. What did I mark here on page 23? What the fuck is this? His sentences are so he's trying to be fucking Virginia Woolf or something. I don't know, but he's trying to do that in like a craft essay, so it's annoying.
Frustrating, yeah.
Yeah. I have on page 23. I underline this as I have often thought of poems as advance bulletins from the interior. Part of the urge toward fabulation, and poetry is a kind of fabulating, has to do with mapping consciousness itself. What do we think? And he said it sorts in the way that dream does. It is not coincidental at all that so many poems use dream as their initial framework. Again, he makes the salient points. What do we think?
What page is this?
Page 23. It's about halfway down in that paragraph, what also occurs. Second full paragraph.
What also occurs.
Is that the story that gets told tells something of the teller, which again is what Xenophanes was suggesting that Holmes cited earlier. Even as the psychiatrist listens to the client's narrative, not for the narrative alone, but for another narrative implied by the more immediate one. So, too, I have often thought of poems as advance bulletins from the interior.
Yeah. So he's just saying the poem is likely to say something that you did not intend. In some way, right? That is in some way telling about who you are as a poet.
And this idea of mapping consciousness itself.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's just using language that is, I don't know, would we say lofty? Right? Like he's using language like consciousness and mapping. We love those words. Poets fucking love saying it, like, I'm mapping consciousness.
Well, in this sense, I think he's saying that we're trying to get all the experiences that could possibly be going through any individual, right? So mapping this consciousness is what I took that to mean. This kind of fabulating, right? The urge toward fabulation. this kind of messiness, right? The messiness of life. We're mapping this consciousness, these
Map.
experiences.
Wait, is he talking about the consciousness of the reader or of the poet? Is it of the reader? What also occurs, though, is that the story that gets told tells something of the teller. Yeah.
I would say both.
Yeah, so of the reader. I mean, it's talking about the reader, or of the writer here.
Because
The
once we
teller.
get to like the mapping, the consciousness stuff, I mean, it is just kind of this. I mean, and this is the same thing. So he's talking about these kind of like myths and these kind of things we call archetypes in literature. And like Sophie said before, I just kind of struggled to know what the point was for this essay. If he's just literally giving like an educational talk to like undergrads in this sense, right? That maybe would not already have sat through, years of these types of lectures and ideas and things.
No, this is the kind of essay that when you're writing your honors thesis in your senior year, you go to pull very specific statements of that can be twisted into whatever you require. But yeah, I mean, most of what I really actually took from this was, I mean, is there anything about, this mapping of consciousness that you wanted to get at?
No, I just don't know why. Like, I don't know what's being argued here. I guess nothing's being argued. It's just being
I mean,
pointed
the only
out.
thing I think what it's almost like he could have just said, in the telling of the poem, we often say things about ourselves that we might not have intended, or that we're actually also telling a story about ourself, right? That in any kind of communication, regardless of what you're saying, you're always going to end up saying something about yourself because the watcher is interpreting, right? The reader is interpreting. And you're not always in complete control of what you're giving off to other people. You only, this goes back to you can only know your experience, really, right? If you can only know your experience, you don't know every single way that you're putting a spin, or you don't know every quirk you're putting into this poem. You don't know how other people necessarily perceive everything about your presentation.
Listeners can
So
read
again,
it
I
and
think
find
it's a
out.
way of saying something that doesn't need to be made complicated. That's saying every time you say something, your reader is interpreting hopefully what you intended, and also some of what you probably didn't intend.
Yeah.
And he's saying something a little more specific than that, right? Like, something about yourself you didn't intend, perhaps. Or maybe it's not about intention at all. But yeah, I think that this is like an essay that just doesn't... It sort of just takes the... the largeness of myth and says, here's how we take myth and make poems out of it over and over again. Here's why you see poems about the same myth over and over again. And here's why that works and is useful.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of fluff in there.
All right, let's move to the next one. Fuck this essay. No rapture.
We don't even have... Yeah, are there particular essay... Because, we've been already talking for an hour or 20. We don't have to talk about every single one.
I don't. The first couple I was more interested in, and then as I kind of moved along, I was less interested in some. I have a couple pages worth of notes here. But just in this one, I think there are some, a lot of this stuff where he talks about original artists, right? Like this idea of original artists.
Yeah. Being held suspect within society. Original artists,
Yeah.
Whereas the original artist who, again, because of the inability to do any differently, will always challenge rather than reinforce societal convention.
Yeah. And that's just what is
don't
original artist?
Agree with that. I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that, actually. The artist will always... There are no great artists who uphold societal conventions. That seems to be a really big statement to me.
Yeah, and
but
I think
I don't know it's true.
he flirts with this idea before kind of rejecting it. Although now, I mean, this book was 2004, almost 20 years ago. He wrote a lot of this, so yeah. And I think this is where it kind of gets into this kind of very much like revolutionary politics of the last 2 decades. I mean, this is just what all artists, by saying this same sort of challenging societal convention.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this.
But if
we
every
wanna-
artist is doing that, is it original, right? Like, is it an original
Right.
artist? Because I can go to any bookstore right now and see a bunch of books that are claiming to challenge the societal
that are saying,
convention.
"Damn the man."
Yeah, but then it's just so. I mean, it's just a weird framing. So I was just, yeah, what is the original artist, or what does he think? What do we think?
Well, I think that he will. I mean, he talks. He has a whole essay on Eliot that I think that I also really struggled with, actually. But I mean, I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Wait, ask your question again.
just what's an original artist?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
An artist that doesn't use fables. I don't know. I mean, I don't
I'm not sure
agree.
he answers that here.
yeah.
Except insofar that he says that original artists, or maybe, well, does he say? Yeah, it's not surprising then that artists are the first to be held suspects within society, original artists, because it's the original artist who, again, because of an inability to do any differently, will always challenge rather than reinforce. So original artists challenge rather than reinforce societal norms. Which I'm sure, I would imagine that as a smart man, he knows that that's like a pretty broad statement. I'm sure that you could do art and seek only to challenge societal norms and be originally shitty. Yeah, I think ultimately this is just an essay that aligns art making with faith, with like a kind of prayer.
Yeah, that's where this gets to in terms of equating prayer with poetry.
And that's really what most of this does.
Yeah.
Right.
And again, it's this pretending, blah, blah. Page 39, he says, what the soul apparently wants of the body is the perfection of absolute obedience. And I was just like, okay, what is the soul here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could like spend forever. You said that was on page 39.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he's getting into the Bible where all these Psalms come from, right? So,
Yeah.
so these little Psalms that he has there. I guess he was raised religious or something, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think soul is like, you could sort of name any of like the internal names for the internal world and it would be accurate.
Yeah, and on page 41 in this one, he goes on to make even what I would have an even bigger issue where he does equate prayer and poetry, and I think is a false framing, but I'll read you the section here. Page 41, the ultimate subjectivity of art makes it as distant and abstract as God, and I would equate the urge to make art with spiritual faith. We believe, or want to, that somewhere there is the equivalent of answered prayer, of divine attention. We call it audience, something that, even if we aren't conscious of it during the act of creation, we must somewhere have in mind. When I write a poem, it's because I have something I need to say and wish to, and it seems only reasonable that to say something is to believe in someone or something to say it to. Utterance, again, as a form of faith.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is just like, what more do you need to say? I mean, yeah, okay. Like, this is sort of your personal desire to align these two things, and that's what it is for you. And I think that poetry is sort of like a, like you said, there's some spiritual aspect to it. It is not devoid of that. But
But to equate prayer and poetry, I think, is a mistake. And I think it stems, and I mean, this is something I've seen for hundreds of years now, everything that I look at with scholars saying this type of stuff, I guess because religion or prayer is considered, sacred, and again, they want to equate poetry to that. So this kind of, I just think it's a false framing. That like when you go down to write a poem, you have this faith that someone will give a shit. I mean, I just don't understand how that's the same as like repeating a prayer that was given to you, or
Yeah, I mean, I just find it to be, I guess, for me as a reader, like an unnecessary. Like, yeah, of course, I mean, unless you're writing poems in your journal, anyone who's had an education in poetry is trying to publish for an audience. I mean, your audience is probably other poets, but like, that's what you're trying for, right? But I also think, I don't know, like you're thinking about audience, sure. Like when you're writing, are you thinking about how can I deliver this message to an audience, or are you thinking like I need to write this? I just want to write this. I'm writing this. And as you go along and as you're revising, you say, would this make sense to somebody else? Is this like, you want it to be good. So like you have audience in mind, right? You have someone else's judgment. You have your own judgment in mind.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't think it's the same as prayer, but
I don't either, but I also just don't think it's necessary. I think it's just like the conclusion he wanted to draw for himself, and fine, whatever. Like I don't really have strong feelings about it either way. I think that Phillips is somebody who probably has a complicated relationship with religion. I wouldn't be surprised if his early life was filled with it.
Yeah, who knows? Let's skip that third chapter because I wrote in my notes that it's total garbage. It's literally just
the one with
closer.
Elliot?
No, with Herbert.
Oh, yeah, dude. I did not. I was like, I can't get through this.
Let's skip to the Elliot one, though. Yeah. Poetry consciousness. Yeah.
Yep. Poetry consciousness gift.
The model of T.S. Eliot.
Oh, God. This is the one where I was texting you.
And this is where it gets... what were you texting me about? I don't even remember.
General frustration.
On page 76, he does this thing where, halfway through the page, but it's a very long, like full page paragraph. But first, I did mention two difficulties of the relationship between humans and the natural world. Again, as if humans aren't part of the natural world. We always have to pretend that to make a point like this. The first, our seeming superiority to the natural world and the detrimental effects, ultimately, which the natural world suffers at the hands of that superiority. The second is how, in the course of a life, it becomes apparent that nature, that the animal world, is not so inferior as we had thought. Gifted with reason, with self-consciousness, we are also burdened by it, by its translation also as consciousness of time and therefore of the end of a life, as an ability to know and therefore anticipate loss, and suffer in that anticipation. And I just have an issue with, like, the same type of thing where I say that, like, the flaw is with human beings, of course, right? Because the flaw can't be with poetry because we have to romanticize it to oblivion. So I just think this romanticizes the natural world as if humans aren't a part of it. And I just don't think that this type of distinction is doing what he thinks it's doing. Like, it's like, like we think we're superior to the natural world. I just don't understand it.
The seeming superior, that's, I think he says the seeming superiority, right? It's not, it's perceived, not actual. So like, I didn't take much issue with that, but I was like, oh my God. Like it's another place where I'm just like, oh, will you just say it? Will you just fucking say it? Will you just not write it as this long sentence? And I'm somebody who loves a long sentence. I fucking love it. But at this point I was like, dude, like chill the fuck out and just say, yeah, we as humans tend to think ourselves as being superior to nature. And then nature tends to suffer. Like, we do dumb shit as people, and we, I mean, the only thing I can take from that is like, we harm the world. Okay, great. So that is, a difficulty of the relationship between humans and the natural world. That's the first one. The second one is what? Is that we've discovered that we are in fact not superior to nature, right? So it's already sort of a false setup. But it's I would say that because he says seeming here, it doesn't give me that much trouble. But again, it's just like, say it.
And I guess I was just in a mood and I went off on this little section here because I'm so sick of hearing it.
Yeah, well, we all did because we were so sick of it.
Yeah,
anyway, go on.
Well, I'm just so sick of hearing this, like, humans think they're superior to the natural world. And my question is just like, not that we're superior, but I mean, like, do animals write poetry? Does a fucking bear write a poem? Like, can a tree fucking write a poem? Like it's just not.
Well,
this...
I mean, I think we're talking about does like having a higher level, of what, I'm going to sort of obnoxiously call consciousness here. Just having like that amount of intellect and ability and development and ability to.
And I would say it's this romanticized nature, right? That nature was this pure thing before humans evolved, and as if humans like didn't evolve from nature itself, right? Like this romanticizing this kind of natural vision, like as pure and good, and then man-made ones as evil, detrimental, bad, just as good as a cow wandering around not writing poetry, so we're all equal to cows now, right? Like this is, I'm so sick of this kind of romanticizing how humans are like a bad thing. Like, it's like, Jesus Christ, like, it's self-hatred, right? Like, I mean, what is this? Like,
yeah, well, and I don't even think
we're not superior to fucking cows.
Yeah, but
we're not superior to fucking cows.
I don't think he's saying cows. I think he's saying like nature broadly is like big. Like, are you superior to like a 40-foot wave that's about to crush you while you stand under it? Probably not.
Right.
Like, it's big as shit. It is of greater force than you. Like, I think it's depending on what we call superiority.
But
right?
he says the animal world,
which we are of. Go on.
Right, we're animal, but like we're literally the top. Like we're the top of the fucking everything. Like we control.
In the course of a life, it becomes apparent that in nature, that the animal world is not so inferior as we had thought. Okay, yeah. Gifted with reason, with self-consciousness. So he's saying like, okay, you have,
and I agree. Reading
you
is
learn
a
that
burden.
we've descended from animals, like
right.
But yeah, it's just one of those things that's kind of like, okay, you could have said this in a way that doesn't really, like, I think he could have left it as like, we're not. Like, we're part of nature, we're not inferior to it, and we are also subject to it, right? Like, we are burdened by it.
Well, that's why I think it's complicated, is that, like, yeah, like, we're not superior to it, but then, like, we are. Like, in terms of, like, 40-foot waves, well, we build, 10-foot seawalls so that waves don't come into our city. I mean, like, we control this. Like, we do this. This is something that happened. Right, to a degree. And I think that's important, that distinction you're saying, to a degree, because we can't control everything, right? We can't change the course of nature's going to keep doing its thing, but like,
and I think I think it also depends on how you define what superiority is, which he doesn't really do here. Are we defining superiority here, which I think a lot of people tend to, as being of greater intellect?
Well, and that's the thing too, is I just think human beings clearly are of greater intellect than any other animal on the planet.
So I think that he's taking a different kind of a broader definition of what superiority might mean.
And like I said, I was just in a mood, I guess. It was just so like, I'm so sick of this noble lie, dude. Like this noble pretending that like, the human's ability to write about our feelings, our self-consciousness, our reason, all of these things, our burden of all those things, right? How that can be considered equal to all these other animals and plants that don't. I guess we don't know for a lot of animals, because not like they can fill out a fucking form for like an experiment or something, but Because I guess there is some reasoning, right? Especially with apes, right? When we evolve from apes, there's reasoning, there's some self-consciousness, all of that. But, like I said, we're the ones that write fucking books and poetry and, like, all that kind of shit. What do fucking cows do besides eat and fart? But yeah, I just like went off on this, and it's just pissed. We said this already. Like, Phillips is so surface level. I find it annoying. Like, this is so surface level. And again, it's this kind of noble liberal thing where it's like this idea of like, oh, the pure world the natural world is pure and good, and then human beings are an evil, a burden upon it. Definitely not part of it. They're just destructive. Blah blah. It's like, yeah, okay. I just don't buy it, I just don't buy it. Anyway, I'm done with my my fucking rant on that.
Yeah, I mean, just so much of this essay is like, I mean, if you just look at every sort of beginning sentence, like, of every section or of every paragraph, of the ways in which we are like and not like the animal world.
Right.
Poetry, consciousness, gift. So he does talk about all of those things mostly, and how we differ and don't differ, I guess, from that world, that animal world, from nature.
Well, and I mean, it's just the same thing. Like, that's why, I mean, it gets this kind of revolutionary politics that everybody's obsessed with right now.
It's not
just
even
continues.
But is it? Yeah, I mean, it's just like we are.
Right. We're hurting the world because we're alive, basically. Like, and I'm just so sick of that as being accepted, like, as if everything was just harmony and like.
But not so much like, I mean, he talks about the ways humans are aligned with animals. It isn't, however, as if humans have no animal qualities or the ability to manifest them.
Yeah, of course.
He says on page 82.
Yeah, and like you said, I'm being too hard because he's trying to make a different point, but it just rubbed me the wrong way.
I just really struggled with, like, I mean, this might have been one of the poems where I was like, so what is this about? Like, what the fuck is this essay about? I think that's what I was texting you about. Like, what the fuck is this about, other than, like, the distinct, like, how we see this distinction play out in poetry? And, like, in examples, like, he gives examples of that,
Yeah.
And then he,
Well, I think that's the bigger point, and we've said this already, and this is the reason I usually find reading Phillips frustrating, whether I'm reading his poems or, in this case, this craft essay or collection of craft essays. It's just, he doesn't have anything to say, like.
Yeah, and then he talks about
most of the
authority
time.
on page 91. These lines move seamlessly from not knowing to thinking to near actualization of a statement that would be the river is a strong brown god. And he's referring to a poem by Eliot, The Dry Salvages. Sorry.
Yeah, and right before that, he talks about on page 90. This is a general suspicion of the There is a general suspicion of the authoritative, of which religion is but a single version in contemporary poetry, and I think that's correct.
Statements of any conviction are considered arrogant, emptily hieratic.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, that's
arrogant, often overbearing, because intellectual and reasoned. So, okay.
Right. He's diminishing what we do, right? So again, hierarchies. This is part of that revolutionary politics that everybody's obsessed with, right? Hierarchies can't exist because hierarchies imply some type of
I think he's
arrogance.
saying that it's stupid that we see it that way, or it's silly that we see it that way, right? Statements of any conviction, right? So this is what I was taking as his definition of authority earlier, right? Any statements made with a lot of conviction, right? Like, or appear to be made with conviction, I think is a better way of putting it, right? Because I don't believe that every poet who says something in a poem with authority actually means it to be true. I know I have said things that I don't believe. And like, we try not to, but it's what happens.
And I think it's right, dude. I think he's correct. Like, there is a general suspicion of anybody who speaks with confidence, authority, where, oh, they're arrogant, oh, that they're playing into a hierarchy, or they're overbearing because they're too intellectual and reasoned or so. Like, I mean, this is like, everybody hates it. People hate people that are confident. Like, if you're confident, you make an authoritative statement, people do not like that. Like, there's like, I don't know what it is, but he's right. Like, there is this general suspicion of anything authoritative. So if you are confident and authoritative in what you're saying, what you're doing, your art, whatever it is, right? Like people naturally are like, oh, well, wait a minute, you're just an arrogant fool. You're not allowed to be arrogant because I'm too insecure to be arrogant, so you're not allowed to be. I mean, that's what it always is. And I think he's right. He's pointed it out, right? He's like, this is really, like he said, yeah, and yet, if anything, poetry should have authority. Why speak if we hardly believe in what it is we're saying, right? So, like, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, I mean, I would put, I think, I think that's like a complicated statement to make, right? Why speak if you hardly believe anything that you're saying? Well, I think people want to have shit to say.
Well, people just like attention, yeah.
People like to say shit, and sometimes I think people will say something that sounds like a truth, right?
It's interesting. I wonder what he would say about this in the social media world, because listeners, keep in mind that this was 2004, right? Social media didn't exist. Well, if it existed, it was MySpace. It was on desktops. It wasn't cell phones. It wasn't mobile apps. It was not Facebook and what we know as social media today. That really didn't even happen until we were well out of college when it started to become like the mobile app. That was like, what, 2010-ish, kind of, 2009-ish, when it started to be on like smartphones. Because we always feel like it's been, the iPhone's been around for, at least I always forget. I'm like, shit, the iPhone's only been around for like 10 years, like, I mean, like 15 years, like 2007 or whatever. I'm just like, oh shit, it feels like it's been around for 100 years already. But yeah, like, so in this sense, I don't think he was thinking of, what, because people say shit all the time they don't believe on social media, right? So it is kind of like Sophie saying, why speak if we hardly believe in what it is we're saying? It's like, well, just scroll social media, dude. People just speak to speak, like.
Yeah, people just speak to speak. But also, like, can you not write a poem? I mean, I guess, people often, I just think, like, saying, why speak if you don't believe what you're saying, or you hardly believe what you're saying? Well, it's like, I mean, can part of you want to believe something?
Yeah.
Without actually, like, can you write a poem as though you are someone who believes something that you don't actually? I mean, I think maybe that's getting unnecessarily bogged down and overly complicated. But yeah, I mean, the point is, I think what he's saying authority is basically someone asserting a sense of this is what is true as like fact. Like, I think that it is when poets state things as though they are true, whether or not they are true. Right? We tend to look at and say, well, is there evidence of this in the world, instead of just like looking at the poem? And I get it.
And if you're authoritative about it, like if you're really authoritative and confident about it, like people will do that instinctively. Like I've noticed it all the time just because I have this blind kind of confidence.
Yeah,
it's
half of what draws us to poems.
That, and like when I'll just say things, like if I'll say an opinion on something or something, I'll notice that people will, even if they agree with me, they'll reflexively start trying to tell me I'm wrong or something, just because that's what they feel, like because they don't like how authoritative or confident I am about it or how I stated it. And it's just a natural thing that people just don't like it. Like they don't like it when somebody's more sure of themselves. And there is this natural suspicion. And like you said, religion is one version of it. So in religion, we could use that as the authoritative thing and be like, well, this is what the Bible says or what the religion says. But, right. And people are naturally kind of suspicious of that. At least now, didn't used to be. But yeah, people just hate people that can make decisions. I mean, and then they want, expect you to apologize for it. Like, nope.
Yeah. Well, it's then do you have to like defend? Right. I mean, like that's, one of the interesting things that Carl Phillips says in here that I think you would be aligned with, is that for him, poetry is like this very private practice, and it is for most people. Writing anything is for most people, but that he doesn't want to share his poems with other people while they're in the process. He doesn't want to share them with other poets. He doesn't want his work to be workshopped. Like, he has no desire for any of that anymore.
Workshop. I mean, I agree with all of that. Yeah, I do. And there's a lot of things I agree with that he points out here.
And
as we
I just think,
through.
What is the workshop's place? There was another point I wanted to make, but also what is the workshop, having your poetry workshopped? What is the place of that in a world where we are skeptical of authority on poems?
Yeah.
Or in poems,
Oh, and it's different because we're not necessarily.
But also are we in a place now where we believe that unless our poems are workshopped, they are not. We have not said anything, that we have not said anything worth saying.
I think
not that poems
we
are
haven't.
Not poems.
Not that we haven't said anything, but
or
I
that
think
we don't trust ourselves to say something that is true, that we need other people to check for us. This is all sort of a side note and tangential and stuff that I think about as somebody who struggles with this, as somebody who struggles with the need to have someone else look at my poems while I'm in the process and say, yep, this is good enough.
We talk about this all the time. I would say it's
not just good enough, but true enough.
I would say it's because that's how MFA programs are designed.
Yeah.
They're not they're designed to put extra emphasis on the workshop. And again, listeners, chime in on some of this stuff, put it in the comments, send us an email, send us your workshop experience. We'd love to get into this. We want to start getting a continuous kind of a segment that we do where we go into workshop experiences and what people dealt with. Would they like them? Do they not like them? If you come in, you think we're wrong, even that, I think that'd be interesting to read somebody telling us why they disagree with us and talking about that. That would be fun. But yeah, I think it's just the way MFAs are set up. They're set up to put this extra emphasis again. And I've said this before, listeners, on various rants, they're set up to have other amateurs sit around a table and not even necessarily tell you your poem's good, but just to talk, tell you what they think. And it's not, there's a place for workshops, but there is workshops can only do so much. And I think it does train a lot of writers, particularly the way MFA programs are set up, not only to separate out of genres. So the fiction are over here, the poetry over here, the nonfiction's over here, and then we keep them completely separate. There's very little overlap in terms of an MFA curriculum in a lot of those, but it's also just teaches people that they to not have confidence in their own shit, because it's you dependent on this group of amateurs to give you an answer for something that, like he said, really can only be determined in private. But so send in those fucking workshop things, y'all. Send it in, heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com, or you just comment it on the YouTube channel and this on our Patreon, whatever. Throw it in there, we'll find it. All right, you want to move on to association?
Yeah. Sorry, there are only, I think, 2 and maybe one small bit in one other essay that I'd be interested in talking about. I don't think we have to spend too long on association in poetry, or that's just my opinion, because I think a lot of it is obvious. Again, that was
yeah.
But it doesn't make it bad, right?
Well, the reason I wanted to talk about association is because I think this is the one I agreed with the most. This is what I was reading through, and I was like, yes, he's correct kind of thing. I didn't really even have caveats where he's. But the first thing I marched to, it's the second paragraph on page 93 in the very beginning of this essay, Association and Poetry. It says, this assembling of a group of images that are related is key to the lyric method. And we talked about this some on our lyric episode, listeners. Check it out, number 19. Key to the lyric method is what makes lyric resemble an extended simile or set of them suspended in time. so that the lyric poem implies a larger narrative of which the poem is intended as a fragment, representative and not entirely so of the larger narrative. The gathering together of images can be likened to a musical chord, several notes held simultaneously to produce a meaning that in music is called harmony. In lyric poetry, we call it resonance, or he does at least, right? Which is more than just meaning. It's more like meaning with a lingering haunt to it, or, back to music, meaning with a vibrato. And I like this idea of poetry being linked to musical scales. And I'm not going to get all music theory on this, but when you look at musical scales, right, like they're not something we invented as so much as something as we discovered, right? Like it's not something that like an original poem isn't necessarily like inventing completely new things, but we're discovering what is already there, right? So like most musical scales are a sequence of notes, a pattern that is just exists out there. And this is why, if anybody's interested, right, like Carl Sagan and all those people, we were sending records and music and like stuff into space with these satellites and shit, like sending them into deep space. We wouldn't send words because assuming that if it's an alien planet, they wouldn't know words, right? So we sent musical notes, literally mathematical patterns just in the universe that we're able to pluck out and be like, put some order around. Again, you could argue this is the superiority of human beings to the natural world. But yeah. So we can discover this, animals can't. But yeah, I like that. I don't know. What do you think? This idea of more discovery than it is creation?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is sort of on point. I think he does this thing where, like, he says a lot of things in here that I agree with, and he provides examples that I agree with, but I'm like, I want to see maybe a more difficult poem that he talks about. Like, I think this is correct, right? I don't always think that lyric resembles an extended simile or a set of them suspended in time necessarily, right? I mean, I think that there is a sense of lyric implying a larger narrative, right? That's what we also hope most good poems do, that it implies some larger narrative beyond just itself, right?
Well, and in the next paragraph he says, by associative poetry, I mean poetry that works almost entirely by means of association.
Right.
No connecting narrative pieces, often no syntactical connection, poetry that is characterized by leaps, not just from stanza to stanza, but from one image to the next, in ways that do not immediately make sense because their relatedness to one another is not clear. And yeah, I think he's correct on that.
Yeah, I mean, me too. I think that was a really, that's one of the places where I think he gave us a definition that was really graspable and clear. Yeah. And he gave it to us when we needed it. And I think he goes on to say something interesting that I think we have discussed in earlier episodes about, there's a line, right, with association. With any poem that works to sort of work with these images, and depending on the person, they might call it like fragmentation. Like, this is a very fragmented poem with different images. People love to talk about fragmentation. They might call it,
Are you talking about the quote on 95 here on page 95? Is that where you marked it?
That's one of the ones that I marked.
Yeah.
But even sooner, when he's talking about something that, I don't know how to say it, Herrnstein Smith says, right? When he's talking about how lyric poetry or associative poems tend to, quote, to represent not overt speech, but transcription, as it were, of an interior monologue. He goes on to say a map of the life of the mind.
Yeah, interior monologue, which again, monologue would imply transcription, but...
or just, I mean, I think maybe he's getting
speech,
at what he'll
words,
later sort of talk about as like, what is it called? Something of consciousness.
Yeah.
The
Mapping?
Not mapping. stream of consciousness. I was just looking for that word.
Right.
You know, I think that's sort of what he's saying. But the way that the mind moves, right, is
Right.
what he's quoting here. So the quote continues, the life of the mind is not always so orderly. We are not always thinking about something specific, and our thoughts may develop from each other through casual associations and lead nowhere in particular. There would seem to be, he says, and this is now Phillips, a greater freedom than to the associative poem. Right? If the monologue is interior, then we are freed of the need to explicate points that are only privately referential, since we know what we mean, right? And he goes on to say, well, no, that's not quite the case. Yes, there's freedom,
Right.
and there's also a problem here. There's also the potential for a problem here, right? We obviously hope to communicate something to others.
He said it's a dangerous freedom because it's the freedom to be arbitrary. And I think that's a very important point. And on page 95, sorry, keep going.
That's where he says it. And you wanna take this one?
On page 95, top of the page, there's this quote that I marked, which I think, again, he's correct about. Which means it may not be immediately intelligible to the reader, but it should be eventually accessible. Otherwise, we are guilty of a self-indulgence that, increasingly, it seems to me, mars much contemporary American poetry, producing work that calls itself oblique or mysterious or vatic, when in fact it is merely obfuscated, not very well thought out, is suspicious of meaning, and privileges the arty over art itself. And when I read that, I was like, yes, he's absolutely correct. We've talked about this before, that the association can be useful, but like if you're going into this realm and then calling it mysterious, like when really it's just bad, like no, it's just poor craft. Like if you're going to like just make these kind of random associations and logical leaps, which again are all over contemporary poetry to the point of meaninglessness, you're not actually writing a poem, right? You're not making art. You're just like grafting on the subconscious mind that doesn't have any direction or anything to it. But yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to talk dangers of association.
Yeah, I think. I think he said it. You know, and it's something that we struggled with when we've read certain collections here, at least two that I can think of that we've read where we've struggled. And this is also often the thing that I think we get hung up on when we talk about poems. And I do mean when you and I are in conversation, like when we are sitting down to record and we have to actually talk about poems, it's the thing that hangs us up.
Later in this section, sorry, what?
It's that, you know, you can't always make sense of one leap to the next. And sometimes it's okay that you can't verbalize it, and sometimes it's really, really not, right? I hate to do this, but I think in the case of like someone like Heather Crystal, we really struggled to have any sense, right? To feel anchored in those associative moments.
Well, and that's because I feel like that was just total garbage. But he goes on to in page 111 in the same essay here, but he said he's talking about an Ashbery poem he uses as an example here, but it is easy to see how Ashbery's well-thought-out project might be misunderstood and viewed as an excuse for other poets to write anything at all in the name of elevated spoof or wry commentary. This is the ever-present danger of the associative method, and can only be avoided via a certain amount of control, which is the artist's vision, a kind of tightening of focus. And this, I think, is exactly correct. So when we say that, yes, something like the Heather Crystal stuff, where she is not using the artist's vision, that kind of amount of control to tighten the focus of those poems so they go everywhere. So without that tightening, that little bit of restriction in there, like you will not write a good poem if you're using the associative method. And I think that he's correct, like the dangers of association. And I think this was his most correct chapter so far. Of course, I don't know if he stands by any of this. He seems to get a little wishy-washy in interviews and things if you ask him about this stuff. Because he's, everybody's afraid of their own fucking authority. I think that's taught in MFA programs too, is
What?
that they literally, not so much that it's taught, but like the way it's set up, it trains that out of you. It trains you to be suspicious of your own authority,
Yes, very much.
which is the worst way to start helping young artists or young people that are aspiring to be artists. It is terrible. I don't know why it's set up this way, but maybe we can ask somebody like Carl Phillips, who literally runs an MFA program. But who knows? But yeah, I liked a lot of that. Anything else on association? Did we miss anything you wanted to hit?
Sorry, give me a second. This is actually, I just have to send this email.
Fuck.
I know it's bullshit. Sorry. I had like Slack and email just blowing up, and I was like, all right, I need to put this to bed.
Oh, dude, I fucking hate Slack, dude.
Yeah, because I was like, I sent myself to unavailable too. Like everything's blowing up because they last minute are scheduling this interview for tomorrow, and I'm like, yeah, sure, just like, why? Fine, I'll do it. Yeah, sure. Let's do it.
Do you want to move on to prose poem?
I would say do we want to talk about prose poem? I actually would say the only other thing that I really want to talk about in this book is Boone and Burden, and maybe a little bit of the one right after it. Do you have anything you wanted to talk about with prose poem though?
Just that he's correct in the page 114 when he just says, increasingly though I encounter prose poems whose form seems less inevitable and more a choice made out of laziness and or confusion.
I'm prepared to talk about this. Yeah, go
Yeah.
on. Please do tell me, because I have read,
correct.
because I also don't, I think this is why like I would really struggle with prose poems. In terms of writing them. I haven't tried many times. I find it difficult to write a prose poem and then look at it and say that it shouldn't be lineated. Because I think I have a strong tendency to write poems that are meant to be lineated. I think I have also read a lot of prose poems that I've read and said, why isn't this lineated?
Yeah, well, he goes on to say, I mean, he's correct. I think he's absolutely correct. And you can see this on the Crystal episode, too, where, like, yes, I think the entire form of hers was out of laziness and or confusion. It was not inevitable. It was not order around the poems. It was
Or just
terrible.
like some like weird broad aesthetic choice that they liked in that moment but didn't necessarily make sense, you know?
And this goes for line breaks, too, but he's not talking about that here. But he goes on to say in that quote, he's quoting a student or generalized version of a student. I didn't know quite what to do with the words as lines, so I thought I'd put them into prose, is a comment I've often heard from students, as if the prose poem weren't itself a form to be turned to not for random, but for particular reasons, just as free verse, if done well, will everywhere display a sense of control and a sense of deliberateness, however intuitive the form may initially appear. Another reason given for choosing to write a prose poem is vaguely political. There is a notion that to write a poem in prose somehow takes a stand against the old guard. He puts that in scare quotes, as represented not only by traditional form, but by those who choose to write in actual lines. My sense is that this line of thinking is connected to the unfashionableness and fear of exercising authority among many younger poets. To make a line, especially in free verse, is to make a choice for which one is willing to be held accountable, or should be. Isn't it easier, always, to turn away? And yeah, of course it is. That's what I mean. Like, people just don't consider any of this and then call it poetry. We praise it. We praise it in all the major magazines and shit. And then we literally, like, we're praising something terrible. Like, we're praising bad work. And it's just so terrible. Like, and it's really, I mean, it's destroying the art. Like, it's destroyed the art. Like, it literally puts everybody in that position of, like, having to defend the art. Like, I mean, he's correct.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's apt, right? Like, I think, again, yeah, I have nothing that I feel like I would add other than the examples that I've given.
Yeah, that's all I wanted to hit on that, because that's literally the main point, and then he just goes on to do close readings to prove it, like, literally for the rest of this fucking essay. So just know that.
Yeah,
listeners.
does he give any examples of poems that don't make sense as prose poems, but are prose poems?
I don't know. I mean, I don't even want to get into
Yeah,
the
we don't have to.
fucking.
We don't have to.
You,
I think that's smart.
yeah, let's move to the Boone and Burden. Or did you want to hit
Also,
anything?
can I just say that having that interview in here, it feels a little...
Say it.
masturbatory.
Here's an interview of me.
Yeah.
I was a little bit
by
excited.
this other famous poet.
Yeah, I was a little bit excited to read it because it was Nick Flynn interviewing him, but like literally a few pages in, I was like, oh my God. Like, Carl Phillips, you're so annoying to talk to, it sounds like. You're so fucking annoying, dude. Like, I bet he got made fun of a lot as a kid.
Yeah.
Because he's so fucking annoying. But yeah, there's an interview in here, listeners, if you want to take. I'm sure you can find this online because I think it was published somewhere else originally.
And I don't think we even have to spend that long on this one either. It's not a very long essay. What is it? 10, 15 pages.
Yeah, although
A lot of it's poems.
It is interesting that this one's called Boone and Burden, Identity in Contemporary American Poetry. And this was one of the more interesting essays in this collection. Again, as we've shit on it for like 2 hours now. But,
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the clearest, right? I feel like some of these others that we have shat on could be more interesting if they were clearer. And, you know, who knows what the fuck? Like, maybe I'm a dumbass. Okay. Boone and Burden. I thought this one was enjoyable, relatively straightforward, said some interesting things. I think, things that... Yeah, go on.
well, I mean, this is easily probably his most controversial essay, if people read this.
Probably. Yeah. Especially now,
Right.
right? Because, again, this was published in 2004.
Yeah. Well, and again, this is just the beginning of that. And now that social media has broadened it, like literally it's the obsession. It's literally all that's allowed is, contemporary identity politics. But on page 160, I think he starts off giving like this little like anecdote about teaching his students this Langston Hughes poem.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, you know, the poem is Island, or the first part of Island, I guess, by Langston Hughes.
But he goes on to say that like his students were struggling or they were talking about it, right? But then he says, once the particulars of the poet's identity were known to them, the students clung to those interpretations that relied entirely on those particulars, and the possibility that Hughes's poem might be one in a broad tradition of poems in English addressing the human condition was abandoned for the certainty that the poem spoke primarily for two facets of that many-faceted tradition: gays and African Americans. Rather than enriching the possibilities for meaning, these aspects of identity had prompted readers to impose on Hughes's poem what it might be radical to suggest is segregation, however inadvertent, but I'll suggest it.
How about that?
Well, I mean, I think it's correct. I think it's entirely correct for what we're dealing with. I think it's gotten more correct.
He experiments with this in his class. Yeah. I think it's funny that he'll give his class, he'll have them read a poem that has no author name attached to it, have them do the interpretation, and then tell them who it is, and then they have this crazy reinterpretation of it. And I think that's great. Like, I think that's a really good way to teach this lesson to students. It's also like exactly the opposite of everything that I was taught as an MFA student, which I also like took issue with, as you know.
Well, and I think it's even more true now than it was in 2004 when he was publishing this. I mean, it's literally this obsession with author biography. Like, we are not allowed to interpret anything else. Like, that's literally like a rule that is reinforced by staff, by peers in the class, by everything. You're not allowed to have conversations about poetry, particularly if it's a black poet, right? If you literally, it takes over everything. So he says, and he said this is
it's
radical,
not even that
right?
you're not allowed. It's that like it ends up being the only lens through which you are
Right.
reading the poem, and then you do the poet a disservice by not acknowledging that they are partaking in this long tradition, which is what Phillips is saying here.
Well, as he said, it might be radical to suggest it, but he calls it literally segregating off Hughes as like in the larger scheme of American literature, because we're so obsessed with this one thing, and it's blinding us to the larger greatness of Hughes' work, like of Hughes, what he means to not just the American canon,
As
but
though
like
he's
literature.
a black poet, therefore he is like somehow distinct from
Right, that's what he means.
this
So
larger
it's literally
canon.
Yes, literally like othering it, like othering, like kind of doing the opposite of what the intention was, I think. But yeah, I think he's correct about this. I think not enough people say it, and I wish Phillips would say it more, because it really is hurting poetry right now. I mean, everybody knows it. We're just, you're not allowed to say it. But you could in 2004, which I think is interesting. And even that he goes on page 161. In an age in which author photographs and the author's private life get as much play as the author's writing, it becomes increasingly more difficult to come upon a poem without bringing to our assessment of it what we know of the author's identity. But ultimately, it should be the identity of the poem, not the poet, that matters. The poem's identity, its virtues or lack of them, must be the focus of our critical scrutiny. When this isn't the case, then the issue of identity only complicates and muddies clear and fair judgment on the part of the reader. Often, too, the poet's judgment becomes muddied. This is why it is difficult to defend as good poetry the bulk of the poems produced by the Black Arts movement of the 1960s and 70s. It rarely transcends its time in history or the individuality of the poet, and I am suggesting that good poetry must do at least these two things.
Yeah. I think this is actually great. I mean, I think that he is. I'm not as familiar with the all the poets of the Black Arts movement. I know a few. One of the big ones that he names here is Amiri Baraka.
Yeah.
Previously Leroy Jones, if you happen to know him by a different name.
Yosef.
Yusef Kuminyaka. Well, he's contemporary though. I don't
Yeah.
think of him. Yeah, he is like the example that he gives is like, this is a poet that talks about race in a way that isn't just about race, like it
Transcends the identity.
It transcends
Yeah.
his identity, right?
Right.
And
it
that
makes it
in that
universal,
one, he's
yeah.
talking about facing it, which is like the big famous poem that you hear in all the poetry classes and is in all the anthologies. It's a good one. You should read it.
And we've talked about
Right.
this all the time. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, he's basically saying, I mean, this is the new critics argument. This is the death of the author argument, right? Without ever saying it. Right? This is the same, essentially the same argument that they were making, which is, the author is dead to you. The only thing that matters to the reader is what is on the page. And what is out beyond the page should not be, influencing too much your judgment of what is on it.
Like you said, it just complicates and muddies like a clear judgment on the part of the reader. So if you're constantly using this as your lens, or you're constantly focusing on this one single aspect, and this is the problem in workshops where you focus
I
on a
just do
single
think it's funny
aspect.
that he
Yeah.
says that, well, yeah. Oh, yeah. When you do focus on single aspects and one person says something and then the whole workshop is infected and now everybody
yeah.
holds only this one lens through which to view this poem.
I mean,
or this
we've
one
all-
line at the expense of all other lines in the poem is the
Yeah.
one thing that gets discussed. We've all been there.
I mean, I literally sat there and watched that happen almost every week. Like,
Oh, yeah.
it was so
Oh, yeah.
hard to sit through a lot
I-
of that.
Or just people just making up bullshit and never being called on it.
Yeah.
That was my favorite. But the thing that gets me here is that he will never at one point, he will never, I say that like I'm condemning him for being some kind of shit. I guess I'm not. I do think it's funny that he at no point in this essay says, I side with the new critics in this regard. because he is like, he's making an argument that has been made in the literary world before, that has been put forward as this is the correct way, and is really well known. And so he puts forward essentially a really similar argument to what they say, at least in this one aspect. And at no point does he say so. At no point does he say, this is, like, these are the people who, this is the methodology that we took in the academy for a really long time, and we have strayed from that. And he does kind of allude to that, but at no point does he say the new critics, which I think is like interesting. Like it would be bad. Is there a disdain, do you think, for that? Like this essay would be, and I might just be projecting this. It's possible that he just didn't even think about that there's no, I mean, he's a smart guy, so I assume he thought about that. But
the issue is the new critics are correct. I mean, that's what it is. Like, if you're going to analyze
but why wouldn't you say that? Why would he not mention them in an essay that is so concerned with essentially agreeing with them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at this point, I think this argument is needed. This argument is needed by somebody like Phillips right now, too. And he's really not doing it, particularly as somebody who's tenured, has a lot of prominence in the field. And he clearly knows this is correct. Like, he knows that, like, this is the correct way to look at poetry and clearly judge and analyze it, like, as a serious scholar. And yes, you have to touch on all these identity aspects if it's in the poem, but not just because, the author is black or whatever. I mean, like, this is what it is.
And he goes on to say, he gives examples of how, quote, identity can inform rather than define the dimensions of a poem, and how the poet in doing so needn't compromise the very important aspects of identity particular to him or her.
Right.
So, I think he does talk about all that. I wonder if there is an attitude, a contemporary attitude toward this method or toward the new critics, like as a sort of what I'm going to call a brand name of, critical theory.
I think there's a conscious rejection of the new critics. I think it's been going on for 60, 70 years.
I guess I'm just asking, like, I wonder, and we can't answer this, right? Because we don't know. I just wonder if that is at play here, right? Like, if there is in this some awareness that if he were to refer to the new critics, that, he would be losing some readers. And that's just a curiosity. It's not something that I think we can answer, like I said, but I just thought it was interesting.
I mean, he's correct on it. I wish
he
would.
He uses really great examples here.
Yeah,
of how it's done well and not so well.
Yeah, and I wish he'd say it more. And you just quoted that, right? On page 62, he says, "What I'm arguing is that this aesthetic is finally a limiting one in terms of the making of lasting poetry. It displaces discipline of music and of argument, without which there can be no clarity of vision, which is the same as no vision, which is the same as no resonance."
Right.
And then he gives us an example of Amiri Baraka's poem, Black Art, which is a good poem. Little indulgent, but yeah, good poem. And I think does make his point.
Yeah, he says, "Well, I can applaud the broadness of mind that chooses to offend many parties equally." And while I think Baraka makes an important point when he says, "Let there be no love poems written until love can exist freely and cleanly," the poem is finally an example of how identity can narrow a poem's scope and can obscure the talents of the writer that Baraka can also be.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, do you agree
too
with this?
Narrow.
You like this poem too.
I
don't think it's a bad poem. I think it's
yeah. I think it's indulgent. The R's.
Yeah, I think
it's
the R's
indulgent.
Are really indulgent.
Yeah, it's fucking indulgent. But poems are bullshit unless they are Like, I mean, that's just a great fucking
A little
line.
bit, yeah.
Yeah, teeth or trees or lemons piled. Like, it's just like, I like that.
Well, either really indulgent or really like, I mean, and
Yeah.
I think we both have tendencies toward these two things, either very indulgent or very like contracted, very
Right.
condensed, very tight, and brief. And,
But I also think Phillips is correct when he says that it narrows the scope. So it is a narrow thing. It's talking about a very
right.
narrow
He's saying
thing.
that this poem could accomplish more in the absence of that very narrow scope of just identity. If it were not
Right.
only identity, right? If that were just piece of it, right? It might do something else too, and therefore ultimately speak to more people, right? And that's sort of what he's talking about when he's talking about like transcending a moment, transcending your own identity, right? It has to exist outside of you and outside of your time. Whatever it is you're talking about has to exist outside of those two things enough to resonate with people outside of your moment and outside of you.
Yeah, outside of your
Right.
timeline, outside of your consciousness, if we're going to use the terms
Yeah,
of the
yeah, yeah.
book. But, and I think this is correct. It's not just this in terms of like identity. You could extend this argument out. Like I see this all the time, and it really gets under my skin. I see poets, contemporary poets, just casually throwing this out there, where this is kind of like everything is political, right? All art is political. They'll just make this statement. No evidence, nothing to support it. They'll just say it and everybody just accepts it as true. But like that is such a narrow frame to view art. Like it is so narrow-minded to say that everything written down is this one, and not just political, but specifically contemporary American politics is everything. And I'm just like, no, like that is so narrow and closed-minded. Like you are not talking about poetry any longer. You're talking about politics, specifically contemporary politics. Like, and it drives me nuts that people just accept that as like a truth or like some big broad thing that nobody questions. I'm just like, no, like they're wrong. Like it's not true. Like no, not everything is political in terms of this. Like and they do these really weird rationalizations or these really weird rationalizations for identity or anything, and it's just a false framing. Like it's not real. Like it's made up one day and everybody just accepts it.
I think the whole everything is political is one of those things of like how much do you want to look at this in that particular lens, right? Like I think
Well, that's what I mean.
Yeah, like you could make
It's
that
a
phrasing,
narrow
sorry, this is-
framework. Yeah.
but like in many cases, yeah, I would say like you have to do a lot of work, to make a statement about a poem that is doing a lot of other things beyond just like talking.
I mean, everybody knows
like,
this.
I mean, yeah.
If you
everybody
scroll,
can make the argument that everything is political, right? Like everything.
if you scroll the timeline, this is all you see. This is all that's published all the time. Every major magazine. This is all we're allowed to talk about in contemporary poetry, at least in public settings. We can do it on this podcast. We can talk about it different ways. We can do it on our own, right? In our own conversations and stuff. But like, if it's literally reinforced and it's despicable, it's not accurate, and it's so narrow-minded. Like I said, it's like a non-artist way of thinking. If you're thinking about art in this sense, like you are not an artist, like you are a political activist. I mean, that's what it is. But again, like we can't have anything but, and I mean, like I said, Phillips is correct. He's 100% correct on this shit.
Yeah.
And he goes even further. It's his identity. He doesn't just talk about being black. He talks about AIDS, being gay, right? Like all these different things you can throw into identity. You could talk about being white, but all that. But that ends this entire essay. The last sentence in this whole essay is: the best writers produce work that resists easy limitation, and the best readers read accordingly. They impose no limits. And that's what I mean. Like all of these things are limiting, narrowing scopes. Like they're just the complete opposite of what art is supposed to be, right? Like it's the complete
Well, and I feel this way
opposite.
whenever anybody names themselves a particular kind of writer, right? Like a particular kind of poet, or like, all of the people that I've met that are like, well, I want to be a regional writer. I want to write, you know, my stories are all about people in North Carolina. Like, okay, great.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I think that's a little less limiting, but like
It
even the
is,
same,
yeah.
you know, I'm a poet of resistance. I'm a resistance poet. I'm
Right. And that's always resistance to what, right?
like, you know, I write activism poetry, or
Right.
you know, like it's all so limiting, I think.
Yeah, it is. And it'll, and I think the point he's making
Why put yourself
broader,
in that hole?
right, is that if you're going to put yourself in that limiting framework, well, then you're not going to transcend the timeline that you currently occupy. So when you're dead and gone, your poems are not going to be remembered as much because nobody alive remembers that time. You know what I mean? Like, it's just like we don't remember what it was like to live in fucking 1500s in goddamn England, but
Right.
we still like Shakespeare. I mean, I have no idea what living like that was like, but you know, his stuff transcends all that, so it's like
Right.
not. Yeah, and you think it's such an easy point, like it's such a simple thing to just understand, and everybody understands it. Everybody knows it, you know, like everybody knows what we're saying. Like it's not a hard concept to grasp, but we like have to keep pretending that it's like I don't know, that like it can't be an obvious truth. I don't know. Yeah, we can move on from this.
So I just want to say, did you want to talk about another and another before that? I know this is where you stopped.
No, but we can. Did you want to talk about anything in that? This is one of the more personal, reflective essays that he has in here.
Yeah, there are two moments maybe.
Let's go.
So on 183, he talks about taste and how taste is shaped, right? In the course of reading, a taste gets shaped for what appeals or doesn't, and a writer's aesthetic gets not so much shaped as informed. I've learned as much about writing from what I don't enjoy as from what I do, even as joy is understandable finally only after its opposite too is known.
Which is correct. I mean,
Yeah, I agree
wouldn't
with that.
argue,
But then there's
yeah.
this other part. And so it is with reading, whereby the self and the writing that comes from that self acquire both dimension and resonance, by the steady increase of which we win the right to exercise that lately suspect thing, authority. We do have the right to an opinion because it comes from more than ourselves, from a self that understands its own context within the history of being human and within that of the literature by which we express being human. Where do you draw the line here, though? Like, I mean, at what point then, by the, like, he says that by reading, you know, we earn this right. We, like, develop our opinions, our tastes, and then, you know, through all of our understanding, we earn this right to have an opinion. And to some degree, yeah, sure. Like, okay, how much? Like, how much do you have to have read in order to earn that right to an opinion? Right?
Well, you don't want
Which,
it to be,
you know,
yeah.
I'm again, this is like a question that I don't think you can answer, but I then think it's interesting that, you know, later on, he says, often young poets want most to know which poets they should be reading. And yet, any poet worth reading probably read everything that came to hand out of that insatiable desire to know, that curiosity that makes us want to grapple with the irresolvable and or memorable and transcribe it in lines.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's yeah, this is the same. We talked about this a little bit with MFA programs setting you up for this. Well, like this is the same thing they set you up with, where they kind of don't encourage you to read widely and broadly. They encourage you to read more narrowly,
Right.
or they make it so that you're just getting like suggestions from a tastemaker or something. So somebody who writes
Right.
for a magazine or a teacher, like have you go to somebody else so that you never actually develop what he calls authority or your own confidence, your own right to an opinion.
Right, and he says range is important. Right. So he goes on to sort of explain that, which is, I think, what we were saying before, right? How important, at what point do you get to earn the right to have that kind of opinion about what is good and what isn't?
Yeah.
So he says range is important, and I agree. Yet any poet worth reading probably read everything that came to hand out of that insatiable desire need to know. I mean, from where we're standing, I look at, if I were to approach all of the books that were in the library when I was in grad school and look at the poetry section, and you told me, you need to pull out 10 of these books that you're going to read before you defend your thesis or whatever, I would be lost. And I would end up only picking things that speak to me, right? And to what I already write. Instead of picking things that have range and might have something to teach me, and all of this under the assumption that my teachers have something to teach me, right? And are better read, or have some sense of this is a book I think every poet should read, right?
Right.
I mean, so when he kind of is suggesting that poets are always looking for what they should be reading. It's well, yeah, what do you expect? How many fucking poets are there in the world? How many collections of poetry get published? So this I thought was kind of, and again, this was published in 2004. So there is we are living in a different moment now, but I think it's perfectly reasonable that poets would want guidance on what to read in a moment where there's so much to read, whether it be classic or contemporary.
I mean, the thing is there's a lot to read, but I'm always read the fucking canon. Everybody is just this. It's this posture that people take where they reject the canon,
right.
As
Well,
if
that's
it was
other thing that I think
put
is interesting
together.
that he says is he essentially suggests that the canon, you get it. He says that there are no shoulds of reading, and he doesn't want to get into the thorniness of literary canons. But how can you not?
Right. Yeah. I mean, everybody's
especially
always,
for a poet who seems to have read much of the a lot of
went to
classic
fucking Harvard.
text,
Yeah.
right. So that I think that I am skeptical of, and in those moments of assertion, it does feel like he is maybe not. He's resisting having a position of authority on that subject.
Yeah, well, because again, the power, the way it's structured right now, that if you're somebody who supports the canon, this is what made Harold Bloom controversial. So if you're somebody who thinks the Western canon is good, well, then you're now not
or even
a good
worth
person.
Reading.
Yeah,
it doesn't
so you're
even
now
have to be that it's good.
And this is again with that political framework. So we put a political framework on it, and then we say, well, now you're a bad person because you like the Western literary canon, and actually we shouldn't expand it. We should narrow the shit out of it or whatever. We should remove people from it because that's, I don't know, some political revolutionary idea that's used to justify. But it's yeah, I mean, if you read that, it's really not that large, man. It's really not that fucking large. The canon is, what, a couple thousand books and stories and poems?
Sure.
I mean,
but it is something that as students, I think, is helpful to have instruction on.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's, dude, you can, and we really don't have a lot of record of stuff that's super early on, right? This is why Beowulf and stuff's in the canon, because it's literally one of the only complete things we have a record of.
Right.
But it's if you went back and you read other stuff that was written at the time of Beowulf or whatever, it's really not as good as the stuff in Beowulf. Literally most of the stuff in the canon is objectively some of the best stuff that's ever been written. I don't like all of it, but all these ideas of narrowing the canon, nah, dude, we should be broadening the canon. It should be adding people, not taking people away. And it's always been this kind of
that's
dumb.
I mean, I do think that people,
Yeah.
I think there are two poles on that, right? There are those people that want to maybe take some people out of the canon because they perceive them to be bad people. Right.
Well, again, it's that narrow political framework that's used to justify.
But then there are also
yeah.
those who do want to broaden the canon. And I think there are those critics who would have argued against that as well. And I think Bloom was also one of them. Says, we're broadening the canon too much. So
Which in a lot of places we are, yeah.
Right, and I think in a lot of places we are also like getting ahead of ourselves too, right? Like a lot of this shit didn't make it into the canon until there was such thing as like,
Right,
a literary canon. Like it's all looking backward.
And people
We
forget
don't know
that, like,
yet,
yeah,
like what's gonna
it wasn't
necessarily
even
make
really
it
a
in 50
thing.
years.
Yeah. It wasn't even really a thing until scholars started getting obsessed with it, like in like the 1800s and early 1900s. Like that's when we started calling it like a canon, like.
But all that's to say, like, this is why we do what we do, and I think he does end this essay in a good place where he says, if we are genuine readers and writers, we should see squarely the impossibility of reading everything there is to read, and yet impossibly we should want to try.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that entirely.
And here we are.
I mean, that's what I'm trying to do.
We are trying.
Yeah. That's what this podcast is about. That's what listeners to this podcast are trying to do, right? Like, we can't. Like, it's almost impossible to absorb even everything in the canon, like, in one lifetime.
Let alone all of the stuff that you, like, want to read that isn't of the canon, right? Because, like, I think most people aren't just like, I casually want to read Shakespeare.
Right.
Like, no. You want to casually read garbage and Twitter. Like, and I do, too. Like, it's what I love, right? And
even Shakespeare is a good example.
It doesn't feed my soul, but it, I don't know. Maybe it's more like eating trash, eating candy. We love that. We love trash art.
Yeah, well, I just mean that even reading Shakespeare, like if you go back and read it, like his contemporaries, well, he was the best of all of his contemporaries. Like literally, if you read any of his contemporaries, some of the stuff we do have records of, well, guess what? Their plays just aren't as good. Like they're literally not as good, like objectively so. Like maybe somebody could make an argument, sure, whatever. But like, it's not like it was malicious. Like, I mean, everybody pretends that it was like this malicious thing. Like, it's literally, it was just a bunch of fucking scholars, like nerdy motherfuckers, like
who maybe had some ideas that on some of it were actually malicious, but like we can't get beyond, like we have to just contend with the fact that
they're going back.
That's how it was in the past, and like history kind of sucks. People were assholes.
People are still assholes, dude.
They continue to be.
It's just,
that's probably that's a different argument. Maybe for a different.
The point he's making is just that, like this is bigger than what we think it is. So if you're going to narrow that framework and you're going to narrow it in any regard, just know that that's what you're doing. Is that you're not doing what the art is intended to do. You are putting something new on it. Like you're putting something that maybe can't even be achieved by the art. We don't know. But yeah. Was there anything else? I kind of clonked out from there, like this like last section. It was really during that
No, that was it. That was I mean, you said you didn't. I didn't read the last essay either. I was like, fuck it. You didn't read it. We're not going to talk about it.
Yeah. We don't need to. Listeners can do it themselves.
Yeah,
if they
we've
want.
Been talking for almost 3 hours anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important stuff, dude. Needed to. It was a longer book.
That's what always happens with craft books, though. Except for color, because we were so sick of fucking trying to talk about color.
Well, and he just had less to say, too. Yeah, anything else? We hit everything you wanted?
Oh, we got everything I wanted.
All right. So, reminder, listeners, we're still looking for those workshop horror stories. Please send us a workshop horror story at heavyboardpodcast@gmail.com. We have subscription plans. Go to patreon.com/heavyboard. You can subscribe to any tier you want to receive full uncensored episodes, bonus episodes for subscribers only. Leave us a 5-star review on Apple. So that helps us grow, helps us boost. Like, subscribe, share to our YouTube channels, anything. Share it with your family and friends. That helps support us. Of course, the books are always linked in the description. And next week we are doing Baby Teeth by Zoj Stage. Is that how you say it?
I think it's Zoya.
Zoya Stage?
Yeah. It's spelled Zoya. J-E. Is that correct?
Well,
Yeah.
big bestseller, so this should be a good one. We'll see.
Yeah, it's a fun one. I told you I already started it, so
So get yourself a copy, listeners, and
grab one. It's fun.
yeah, get ready to get the heavy board treatment.
Oh fuck, my shit stopped recording. That's fine. I'll save it.
Damn.
I mean, it just stopped recording too.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
All
Like
right,
it recorded like almost 3 hours and now it's done.
Whatever. I have the backup on this side.
Yeah, I figured.
So Sophie will sound a little patched in places. This has been Heavy Board. See you.
Man.
Heavy.
Bored.
Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
I may say that the male is entirely hostile. No! You know,
Resources.
life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. Are you radioactive now?
Inner.
Resources, American resources.
Being bored?
Some activities are intentional, right?
It shows such a lack
Heavy.
of gratitude for life. Bored. I aspire to boredom, I
Heavy.
should say.
Bored. Heavy.
I am heavy.
Bored.
Has you the night sweats and the day sweats, pal? Pal, I do.